Okay, Chair, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the February 25, 2021 Delta Stewardship Council meeting. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Council, and I'm glad to be able to be with you here virtually this morning. Council members, let's start with establishing a quorum with a roll call alphabetically, starting with Judge Damrell.
Damrell here.
Is Maria with us? Okay, Don?
Yeah, Don and Tola here. Morning.
Good morning, Don. Christy?
Good morning, Christy Smith here.
Morning, Christy. Susan Tatayan here. And Daniel?
Daniel Zingali here. Good morning.
Morning, Daniel. Well, we have a quorum, so we'll move on to agenda item 3, the consent calendar. So members, in the materials we received yesterday, we received a public comment on item 3B of the consent calendar, approval of an interagency agreement with State Water Resources Control Board. So we removed the item from the consent calendar and publicly noticed that change to the meeting agenda yesterday. And we'll take up the item as agenda item 4 after we finish the remaining consent calendar items.
Madam Chair, I would move the consent, remaining consent, the adoption of the January 28th meeting summary.
Great, thank you, Don. Do we have a second?
Second.
So moved by Councilmember Natoli, second by Judge Damrell. Is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay. And council members, is there any need for discussion? And are there any objections to adopting the consent calendar? Okay, hearing no objections, the motion is adopted by unanimous consent.
Madam Chair, if I could simply request I be marked as abstained since I wasn't present at the last meeting, please.
Yes, thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
On to agenda item 4, approval of an interagency agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board. I'll hand it off to our Executive Officer, Jessica Pearson, to cover this item.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, I ask for your approval of a new $500,000 interagency agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board. This agreement would allow the council to continue to provide the Water Board with independent scientific peer review, scientific advice, and workshops that inform vital Delta efforts. And with me today, I have Dr. Louise Conrad, my Deputy Executive Officer for the Science Program, to give a brief presentation on the item. Louise?
Good morning, Chair Tatayan. Morning, Jessica and council members. I will be brief. This is covered in one of your staff reports for this agenda, this meeting this morning. I want to note that this agreement that at hand is a receivable agreement in which allows the council, as Jessica said, to provide peer review advisory services for scientific panels, workshops, to support the State Water Resources Control Board's water quality control plan for the Bay Delta and the update to that plan. I want to note that this is work that the council has done to provide services for the board in this fashion since 2013. And this agreement will allow a continuation of that work. One example of the work that we've done is as recent as 2019, in which we provided a scientific advisory panel on that we organized for the board that directly informed the biological goals for the lower San Joaquin River. It also informs the Sacramento River and Delta-wide biological goals. this report helps inform the water quality control plan update and may also help inform the voluntary agreements for the water quality control plan update for tributaries. This is an example of the excuse me, sorry, my internet seemed to go out. Are there any questions on this item? I think that would be helpful to have specific questions if there are any.
Madam Chair, Member Natoli.
Yes, Don.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, and this goes to the correspondence that we received from that. Actually, I guess the reason we moved this to a non-consent item. Could someone address that? Because again, not necessarily in detail, but they raise issues about funding that should go to to the Independent Science Board and so forth. I think you've obviously explained the purpose of it and it's being recommended by staff. But if someone could just at least generally address the concerns expressed by the folks who weighed in from the San Joaquin Audubon Society.
Absolutely. I could start, Louise, and then if you want to offer any additional detail. Yes, I believe the commenter misunderstood that this was money that the council was sending to another agency. Specifically, they were concerned that we were sending money to the Department of Water Resources to fund science related to conveyance. That is not the case. This is funding that we would receive up to that amount in providing science services to the State Water Resources Control Board. This is not the kind of work that the Delta Independent Science Board would typically do. They have a much higher level statutory charge to do reviews that are really at their discretion, not contracted for science services like in this case. So appreciate the comment and the opportunity to clarify, and hopefully the staff report in this presentation addresses those concerns.
Thank you, Jessica. If I could just say, it might be helpful too that to reach out to the commenter. Obviously, we didn't have multiple comments. I know you can't do it in every case, but to explanation, I trust they may be tuning into the meeting here, so they may have heard that already. But if they had any other questions, I think you've explained it very clearly, and it was my understanding what you just said that that's how it works. But I think that would be helpful for future reference. So anyway, thank you. That's all I had.
Okay. Any other questions from the council? And do I hear a motion?
Motion to adopt.
I think we need to do public comment.
Oh, let me back up here, and I want to thank the individual who sent the comment in ahead of time for sending your comment in ahead of the meeting. If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment, please send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to comment on. Also, please note if you wish to speak or would like the clerk to read your comment for you. When your name is called, the clerk will unmute you or read your comment if requested. So on that note, are there any other public comments on agenda item 4?
There are no public comments.
Great, thank you, Brandon. So if I heard correctly, Judge Damrell moved for
Yep.
approval.
Second.
And Maria Moranian, Councilmember Moranian, second. So council members, let's go ahead with the vote, starting with Judge Damrell.
Damrell, aye.
Maria?
Moranian, aye.
Natoli, aye.
Smith, aye.
Atayan, aye.
Zingali, aye.
And agenda item 4, approval of interagency agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board is approved. On to agenda item 5, the chair's report. First, I'll start with congratulating council members in Gali. The Senate Rules Committee confirmed Daniel's appointment with a 5-0 vote yesterday, and that bodes well for the full Senate approval of this confirmation. So congratulations, Daniel.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan. Thank you.
Yes. I also want to introduce our new council member, Christy Smith. This is her first meeting today, and we wish you a warm welcome, Christy. Glad to have you aboard. Would you like to introduce yourself, offer a few comments?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Christy Smith. I am zooming in from the Santa Clarita area of California this morning. This is my home, and really pleased to be a part of the board. I appreciate your welcome, Madam Chair, and I wanted to extend my greatest thanks to staff who have been incredible over the last couple of weeks, getting me up to speed to be able to participate today. So I look forward to this work. It's really exciting, and I'm glad to be part of the team.
Great. Thank you, Christy.
Welcome.
And another item for the chair's report, I wanted to let you all know that yesterday I participated in the Municipal Water District of Orange County's Water Policy Forum with Nancy Vogel, and the forum was addressing the governor's water resilience portfolio. So Nancy and I had an opportunity to inform folks about what is in that portfolio, how it is aimed at achieving the state's co-equal goals, and how the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan is complementary to the water resilience portfolio, and in fact, quite helpful to it. Now let's move on to Amanda Bowl, Special Assistant for Planning and Science.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan, and good morning, council members. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to walk you through the March 15th Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee agenda. Excuse me. As the council's climate change initiative, Delta Adapts, moves into phase 2 adaptation, and the Newsom administration begins to implement the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, DPIC agencies have an opportunity to discuss how Delta Adapts can link to and collaborate with planning efforts underway by other DPIC agencies. So we've pulled together a panel moderated by the council's Andrew Schwartz to discuss various aspects of nature-based adaptation. So we're going to have River Partners President Julie Retner discussing floodplain solutions in the South Delta. And then we're also going to have California Department of Food and Ag Science Advisor Amrit Gunasekera presenting on what was learned during recent CDFA-hosted farmer and rancher-led listening sessions. And we'll also have a representative from the Resources Agency on the panel to discuss progress toward the governor's executive order and their aim toward 30 by 30 and updating the state's adaptation plan. So we're also going to, Delta lead scientist Dr. Laurel Larson will discuss her vision as lead scientist, and Laurel will also be introducing Dr. Jessica Rudnick, who I believe you all met last month, who is the Council and a California Sea Grant new social science extension specialist. So Dr. Rudnick will present her work plan and discuss how she anticipates engaging with the other DPIC agencies and the work she'll be doing to better integrate the social science into the work that we're doing here throughout the science enterprise. And then finally, we will receive a report out, excuse me, on the science needs assessment, which was one of 3 priority actions that DPIC endorsed to achieve ongoing, consistent, and reliable science funding. Delta Independent Science Board members, Dr. Steve Brandt and Dr. Jay Lund, will present what is shaping to be the scientific focus of the science needs assessment, and also be asking DPIC members to contribute members to an interagency task force to really help the planning team that's drafting the science needs assessment refine the recommendations to ensure that they're really applicable and working toward the goals that we're setting forth in the science needs assessment. So it will be a packed 2 hours, and hope that some of you are able to tune in, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the agenda.
Council members, any questions for Amanda? Okay, thank you, Amanda. Brandon, is there any public comment on agenda item 5?
There is no public comment.
Okay, thank you. Well, on to agenda item 6, Executive Officers Report with Jessica Pearson.
Thank you. I also want to extend my welcome to Christy Smith, and as well, I'd like to express my appreciation for Mike Gatto, who had quite a bit to contribute to the council and its mission over the 3+ years that he served on the board. So my best wishes to him and a warm welcome to Christy Smith. I've got a couple of announcements here today, so please bear with me. We've got a lot going on this February. Just as a regular reminder, most of our staff continue to work from home, but remain available to assist the public. Our public meeting formats will continue to be fully remote for the time being, but if anyone needs to contact staff at the council, there are multiple ways to do so, and you're encouraged, the easiest way is to email hello@deltacouncil.ca.gov, and we'll direct you to the appropriate staff person. I also encourage people who are interested in our public meetings to check our website regularly, to sign up for our listserv. And on our website, we post regular updates to our meeting times and formats, and including information on how to participate. We've got a couple of announcements related to our Delta Adapts Climate Initiative. We do have an agenda item on this later this morning and a public comment opportunity, but I wanted to provide a few quick updates. First, the public review draft of the vulnerability assessment, which is essentially the first phase of this work, is currently available for public comment through our extended comment period date of March 16th. The document is available on our website, and members of the public can submit comments today on that agenda item or by submitting them via email to climatechange@deltacouncil.ca.gov. Building on the various engagement efforts we have for this project, the Delta Adapts team invites anyone to join our virtual climate resilience scavenger hunt through this Friday. Delta sleuths of all ages are invited to participate to receive a certificate of participation and a chance to be featured on the council's social media. So for more information, please visit our Delta Adapts page on our council website. And finally, as we prepare to begin the adaptation strategy phase of this project, the council will be holding 2 virtual public workshops to receive feedback on the scope of the adaptation strategy. So the first of those workshops is tonight from 4:30 to 6 p.m. And the second is Monday, March 1st from 4 to 5:30 p.m. You can register for either workshop by visiting our events page on our website or emailing engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. This past month, the council sent 2 letters to further Delta Plan implementation and coordination, and those letters are available in your board packet as well as on our website. The first letter was sent by the Delta Science Program to the Water Board regarding their framework and strategy for freshwater harmful algal bloom monitoring. The strategy seeks to identify considerations required to monitor those freshwater harmful algal blooms throughout the state. In order to receive structured feedback from experts, the science program urged in our letter that the Water Board integrate a peer review process into the development of monitoring plans. And the letter offers further recommendations for the strategy and encourages coordination with the council and leverage opportunities with some of our council-funded research that's related to those efforts. The second letter was to the Department of Water Resources regarding draft guidelines they are preparing for their Proposition 68 Flood Management Protection and Risk Awareness Program. The program funds flood protection and risk reduction projects throughout the state, and the council's letter states that projects funded by that program that occur within the legal delta or the Sassoon Marsh could be covered actions under the council's jurisdiction. So as a result, the letter suggests that the department include language in their guidelines to this effect, and we encourage early consultation with the council. If you have any questions about these projects at any time, or these letters, please let me know. We have quite a few covered action certificates right now. It's been a busy month and we have 4 to report to you. First, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board submitted a certification of consistency in late January for their American River Common Features Sacramento River Erosion Left Bank Protection Project, long title. The Flood Board finds that the proposed project is consistent with 7 Delta Plan policies and finds that the remaining policies are not applicable. The project seeks to construct levee improvements consisting of over 1,000 feet of erosion repairs along the Sacramento Riverbank near mile 55.2 in Sacramento. And the project's public review and appeal period is currently open and closes on March 1st, 2021. Second, the Department of Water Resources submitted a certification of consistency with the Delta Plan on February 2nd for their Bradmore Island and Arnold Slough tidal habitat restoration project. The project seeks to provide over 850 acres of tidal waters and salt marsh habitat, which is to meet the obligations of improving habitat conditions for special status fish species. And this is all part of complying with federal permit requirements. The public review and appeal period closes for that one on March 3rd, 2021. Third, the Brannon-Andrus Levee Maintenance District submitted a certification of consistency on February 8 for their Sacramento River Erosion Control and Habitat Enhancement Project. The project aims to resolve erosion issues on the left bank of the Sacramento River on Brannon Island. The project includes about 1.2 miles of levees, fish-friendly habitat, and minimizing long-term maintenance and repair costs by repairing existing areas of erosion. The public review period and appeal period closes for that project on March 10th, 2021. And then finally, the Department of Water Resources submitted a certification of consistency on February 22nd for their Lookout Slough tidal habitat restoration and flood improvement project. The project seeks to restore over 3,100 acres of tidal wetland habitat in Lookout Slough, including habitat that's beneficial to Delta smelt and other fish and wildlife species. The proposed project would also provide improved flood conveyance, increased resilience of levees, and reduced flood risk. For that project, the public review and appeal period closes on March 24th, 2021. We'll continue to keep the council updated on these certifications. If you have any questions, please let me know. Moving on to personnel announcements, we have 2 new hires this month. Sarah Farnsworth joins the Planning and Performance Division as their 2021 Sea Grant Fellow. She'll be assisting with Delta Adapts, the Environmental Justice Issue Paper, and other projects. Sarah comes to the council after completing her master's in Environmental Policy and Management at UC Davis. She previously worked as an intern with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where she developed a petition to list the white abalone as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act. She also worked as a graduate student researcher at the Nature Conservancy. Welcome to Sarah. Megan Wilson joins our legal office as a senior attorney. Megan has significant litigation, environmental, and administrative law experience representing public agencies and tribes during her legal career. She's an honors graduate of McGeorge School of Law, and we're excited to have her here at the council. Included regularly in your board packets, you have a written legislative update, which includes bills of interest that we are tracking. We do not have an oral report on our legislative update this month, but if you ever have any questions about any of those bills, please feel free to reach out to me or to Ryan Stambrough. And then finally, that brings us to item C here, which is our proposed 2021 Delta Stewardship Council priorities. In your packets is the work plan for the council's priorities. These priorities were derived from a 2-year work plan that we developed with the council over the course of 2019 through a series of discussions and workshops. These priorities are designed to advance 2 of the council's current primary objectives. The first is to strengthen and implement the Delta Plan, which is the state's single comprehensive blueprint for the Delta. And the second is to build capacity for what we refer to as One Delta, One Science, or a more coordinated and collaborative approach to advancing Delta science. So the coming months include continued work on Delta Adapts, our climate initiative, also an amendment to the ecosystem chapter of the Delta Plan. We are updating the science action agenda and updating and finalizing the Delta Levies investment strategy over coming months. We'll also be awarding science funding under our competitive research effort and executing for the first time ever virtually our upcoming and very popular Bay Delta Science Conference. So this work plan also considers many of the council's day-to-day foundational activities, such as covered action, review, and early consultation for those projects, peer reviews, and the various overall administrative functions of the organization. So it's going to be a busy year for us at the council. I'm truly looking forward to the conversations that shape our work as we pursue these milestone projects in pursuit of our mission. I have with me here Jeff Henderson, our Deputy Executive Officer for Planning, and again, Dr. Louise Conrad, Deputy Executive Officer for Science, to provide a quick overview of their division's key work plan items and to answer any questions that you may have. Brandon, are Jeff and Louise in the room?
Hold on.
I am here and I will lead off if that's okay, Jessica. Thank you. So good morning, Chair Tatayan again, and council members, and welcome to Christy Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight some Delta Science program priorities for the coming year. I'm going to note up front that many of these activities are multi-year projects. So we are building on significant work from previous years, and we're starting to see some of our hard work bear fruit. In other areas, we are setting the foundation for work that will be completed in future years. And I also want to say up front that in nearly all cases, while these projects have specific lead people within the science program, we are relying on collaborative efforts of both internal and external teams. And we really enjoy the opportunity that these projects present us to build partnerships that expand the effective network of the council. And so with that in mind, I'm going to mention 5 projects we're prioritizing for 2021. In the area of science funding, and led by Dylan Stern and Henry DeBay, we will complete the proposal solicitation package process that we started last year to fund science activities that are responsive to the current science action agenda. And as you've heard in previous council meetings, this effort is in partnership with the US Bureau of Reclamation and will award up to $9 million to high quality research proposals in the Delta. In the early summer, you'll receive a full presentation on the proposals that Dr. Laurel Larson recommends for funding based on external reviews. You'll hear a more detailed update from Dr. Larson in her lead scientist report a little later this morning. In a separate project related to science funding, we expect to reach a major milestone this year with the Delta Science Tracker, led by George Isaac and Maggie Christman. This will be a web-based tool aimed at improving transparency in science funding in the Delta and also to foster increased collaboration within the scientific community. We've been working with an environmental consulting firm over the last year to design this tool, and we expect a prototype of it to launch this summer. The Delta Science Tracker is going to address needs that are identified in DPIC's Science Funding and Governance Initiative, and we're highly optimistic that once launched, it will increase awareness of current and past science activities and also help managers visualize funding streams for science. 2021 will also be an important year for us to advance our work in the area of science planning. With Rachel Klopfenstein at the helm, we will be continuing work to collaboratively develop the 2022 through 2026 Science Action Agenda. You may remember that we recently published the top 65 management questions for the Delta and developed through significant outreach that we did last year. We're going to leverage this list to create succinct management themes and then identify needed science actions to address management questions. And we're targeting early summer for a workshop to develop these science actions. We also have significant work planned in the areas of science communication and synthesis. And the first of these, Jessica's already mentioned, and you'll hear more about from Dr. Larson later, which is the 11th Biennial Bay Delta Science Conference in April. within the science program, we are very grateful for the fearless leadership from Lynn Takata and Maggie Christman to navigate the planning process for this first all virtual format for this large conference that is one of the most important venues in the region for exchange of scientific findings. For synthesis work, I want to highlight our efforts this year to develop the next edition of the State of Bay Delta Science. This is one of the components of the Delta Science Strategy, and it communicates and synthesizes the state of science for a given topic area. Here, Maggie Christman and Sam Bashevkin are leading by first identifying an editorial board that includes external prominent scientists. And with this board, we've landed on the theme of services and disservices of plants and algae in the Delta for the 2022 edition of the State of Bay Delta Science. The edition is going to cover chapters on native and invasive plant ecology, control of aquatic weeds, harmful algal blooms, and the role of aquatic plants in carbon sequestration, as well as emerging technologies for monitoring plants and algae. The chapters are going to be drafted and submitted this year to the San Francisco Estuary for Watershed Sciences for independent peer review. Also in the area of synthesis, we're piloting a new effort this year for the Delta Science Program, which is to partner with the Santa Barbara-based National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. This will facilitate an intensive working group of scientists in the fall to develop analyses and synthesized information on drivers of the Bay Delta food web. Here we have Pascal Gertler and Sam Bashevkin driving the bus for this new and exciting effort that will provide critical information for management while also deepening the analytical skills of our scientific community. And then finally, and last but not least, I want to mention that through the hard work and dedication of Karen K. Fitz and Edmund Yu, the Delta Science Program continues to provide support for the Independent Science Board. And this year, a major goal for the Delta Independent Science Board is to complete a draft of one of its most significant review efforts, the Monitoring Enterprise Review. And the goal of this review is to evaluate the current environmental network for the Bay Delta and whether it's meeting management needs. The team has already completed an inventory of over 150 unique monitoring activities. And the Delta ISB will complete its final report this year that will include its major findings and recommendations to enhance the network for the monitoring network for the estuary. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I will pass the baton off to Jeff Henderson for 2021 priorities for the Planning Division.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Louise. It's a pleasure to be here to highlight some of the Planning and Performance Division staff's key priorities for this upcoming year of 2021. The first item I'd like to identify is the Delta Levies investment strategy. And again, similar to the science program, many of these items we're going to discuss today are continuations of work from last year and in many cases previous years, as these are all multi-year efforts. So the first is the Delta Levies investment strategy under the leadership of Andrew Schwartz and Aaron Mullen. And for that effort, council staff have been working on updates to D-lists in response to council direction in March of 2020 to evaluate new LIDAR information data for levees and island floor elevations. You may recall that rulemaking we were undertaking for the D-list was withdrawn in March 2020 to allow staff to evaluate that new information. And we anticipate presenting the results of that evaluation to the council this spring. Staff is also considering revisions to the proposed regulatory language that was in place or was being proposed at the time, and has held stakeholder discussions regarding those revisions in the early portion here of 2021. And we do anticipate reinitiating the rulemaking process for the D-list over the summer. Another major initiative for the Planning Division is the continued progress on the ecosystem amendment to the Delta Plan under the leadership of Harriet Ross and Kaylee Griffith. Council staff has been engaged in a multi-year effort to complete that project, and we're now working on an environmental impact report for the project, anticipating bringing that EIR before the council for public comments this summer, and then presenting the amendment to the council for potential approval toward the end of the year. You've heard from Jessica regarding the Delta Adapts project. That's under the leadership of Harriet Ross. We're excited to embark on the next phase of that effort, an adaptation strategy here in 2021, We're going to continue to work with stakeholders and our federal, state, and local agency partners to better understand how climate change and sea level rise impacts the Delta, and to continue to identify some collaborative and proactive steps that will help Delta resources and people become more resilient. Council members will continue to receive progress updates at meetings throughout the year on Delta Adapts, including today's item to receive public comments on the draft vulnerability assessment. The Planning Division is also engaged in implementing a number of recommendations from the 5-year review. You may recall that in 2019, the Council completed that first mandated 5-year review of the Delta Plan, which set forth a number of recommendations regarding how to implement the plan. Staff will be seeking Council input on a number of these recommendations in 2021, including our continued engagement with the Department of Water Resources to promote reduced reliance on Delta water supplies in urban and agricultural management plans, an effort led by Andrew Schwartz and Dan Constable. Updates to the Delta Plan's administrative performance measures led by Martina Kohler and the entire performance measures unit, and an environmental justice issue paper we're kicking off at today's council meeting under the leadership of Avery Livingood. Staff will continue to provide updates to the council on the overall progress of all of these items in 2021 as well. And then in addition to these priorities, we continue to support Delta Plan consistency certification of covered actions through early consultation, coordination with the science program, comments on CEQA documents, training for agencies and stakeholders, and maintenance of our online certification system. For comparison, we've already received the 4 certifications this year that Jessica summarized in her executive officer's report, compared to 7 of the entirety of last year. Depending on project timeframes, additional covered actions or appeals may appear before the council in 2021, and we'll provide any updates on those matters as they emerge. We're very much looking forward to working with you on these items throughout the new year here in 2021, and I'd like to hand off to Amanda Bowl to summarize some of the communications and outreach priorities. Thank you.
Actually, Jeff, thank you. I think we decided, since Amanda had her presentation earlier, that we weren't going to include her here, although we can certainly cover if there's any questions on those items. At this point, it's been a lot of information, so I want to now pause and entertain questions that the council members might have.
Question, Madam Chair?
Yes, Don.
Yeah, just on the Bay Delta Science Conference, I assume there's an opportunity if, again, it's a virtual conference, but if we wanted to attend all or a portion of that, we can work with staff to register for that. Again, I don't know my availability, but I know in the past, several years ago, I had a chance to, attend a couple of the sessions. And again, I'd be curious about how we would go about that if we wanted to. Again, for a portion, it wouldn't be for all. I don't think all 3 days, but.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead and answer that. You are very welcome to attend any part of the conference, and we're happy through the virtual format. We're actually able to offer the conference as a free event to anyone that would like to attend. So we have registration details forthcoming, and we are happy to work with you to register and share the agenda so you can pick and choose.
Yeah, and that may be helpful, Louise, to help navigate, things that will be way above my head, I'm sure, as it relates to science, but other things that will be, I think, useful during our work here on the council and work with the commission as well. So, okay, good. I'll look forward to that information forthcoming. Thanks.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Certainly. Any other questions? Well, hearing none, is there any public comment on the executive officer's report, item 6?
There is no public comment.
Okay.
If I may, Madam Chair, then let me pivot to just briefly previewing the rest of the agenda, and then I can close out. Today with us, we have the Delta Watermaster, Michael George, who will report on his office's activities related to the Delta Plan. We'll also have a presentation on the council-funded Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool. Then, as we mentioned earlier, We will have a opportunity for the public to address the council and a brief update on our Delta Adapts public review draft that is out now. And then we will also conclude with a discussion about the scope for our environmental justice issue paper. And so with that, unless there are any other questions, I conclude my executive officer's report. Thank you for bearing with me. There's a lot happening this time of year, and so there was a lot to report to you all.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. And all the items on the priorities for the council are quite intensive work. On to agenda item 7, Delta Water Master update by Michael George, our amazing Delta Water Master. Michael?
Good morning, Chair Tatayan and members of the council. Particularly good morning and welcome to Councilmember Smith. I am the Delta Water Master, and it's probably worth just reminding that my position was created at the same time as the Delta Stewardship Council as a provision of the 2009 Delta Reform Act. And one of the important roles that I have, and that is in that statute, is to make regular reports to both the Stewardship Council and to the Water Resources Control Board. So I report jointly to those two boards. And I was particularly pleased this morning to listen to Jessica and the staff reports about council priorities, because it really emphasizes one of the things that is at the heart of my role, which is collaboration among the Stewardship Council and the Water Board, which have overlapping interests and responsibilities. So in one sense, I feel like my role is to be part of the connective tissue between those two boards that I report to. I'm an appointed official. I'm midway through my second 4-year term. And so this is a regular report that I give, but today it's a bit abbreviated just because of all the things that you've heard about and all the things that are on your schedule. So if I could go to the next slide. There are really two things that I want to emphasize today in order to make this a somewhat abbreviated report. And one is what we're doing about drought preparedness, particularly in the Delta, as we see dry conditions unfold. And then secondly, I want to speak briefly about specific responses that we are taking in collaboration with lots of other agencies to respond to the accelerating deterioration of conditions in the Southern Delta. And in previous reports, I've described what's going on in the Southern Delta, why it's deteriorating both in terms of its reliability for water supply and ecosystem services. So briefly, I'll touch on some of the things that we're doing now in collaboration with other agencies, including the Stewardship Council, to address those. So next slide, please. In terms of drought preparedness, I want to describe a workshop that took place at the Water Board's most recent meeting on February 16th. There are 3 big takeaways that are listed here, and I want to go briefly into each of them. First of all, current hydrology, and the graphic there on the right is the most recently released California Drought Monitor. And it shows that drought is becoming more prevalent in the Delta and not in the Delta, in the Delta watershed, and that dry conditions are increasingly impacting various areas of the state. So starting from that, recognizing that 2020 was a dry year and that we go into water year 2021 with somewhat reduced storage in our rim reservoirs. And so it's appropriate to work and think about how we will respond and how we will assist water users throughout the state to respond to the impacts that we would expect if it continues to be dry. And unfortunately, as we're looking at the long-term forecasts through March, it looks pretty dry. And obviously, March and then the beginning of April are the tail end of our traditional wet period. So the fact that there is not much more precipitation in the long-term forecast gives some urgency to planning for these conditions. So the second thing that came out of the workshop on the 16th was that a lot of work has been done in our office, in the Division of Water Rights, in the Bay Delta unit of the Division of Water Rights, and in the Division of Drinking Water to prepare for shortage conditions. The first part of that is clearly to learn from the experience that we had in the long-term drought of 2012 to 2016, and to improve the tools we had, and particularly to improve some of our ability to forecast water availability, the yin and yang of supply and demand, particularly in the Delta watershed, which is the most important in the state because it covers about 40% of the state. When you think about the watershed for the Delta, it's about the same size as the entire state of Wisconsin, just to put it in perspective. 40% of the land mass of California is drained through the Delta. Because it is so complex, a lot of the work that we've been doing in developing tools, we've actually developed in less complex watershed. And I want to give a shout out to our Division of Water Rights for significant improvements in the visualization and understanding of tools for projecting supply and demand. We focus that particularly on the Russian River watershed, which is complex enough. But those tools, as we continue to develop them, will help us to understand and to visualize what water shortage means in the Delta. In part of our lessons learned from 2012-16 drought, we've done a lot more outreach. And at the board's meeting on the 16th, the Division of Water Rights reported on the report that they've developed as a result of that outreach, asking water users and water managers throughout the Delta watershed to help us understand what we could do better to be of more assistance to them. And this is very consistent with the governor's resilience portfolio, which talks about what the state can do to empower local and regional water supply managers. So we've also spent a good deal of time trying to focus on reducing errors in the reports that water users send to us, where they report how they use water in the Delta watershed. And we've identified, talked in earlier reports to this board about what kinds of issues we have with errors and inconsistencies in the way water use is reported in the Delta. We're working on that. We're acknowledging that we have inadequate facilities to measure diversion and stream flow. The legislature has proposed some initiatives to increase stream flow gauging, so we have a better sense of what water is moving, where and when through the system. And we're also working on getting better insight on diversion measurement. I've talked about that before, particularly with our Delta alternative compliance plan with Water Code 1840, the diversion measurement requirements. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but we really are using a lot more advanced technology to understand how water is used in the Delta and the Delta watershed. And of course, it kind of goes without saying that we're still waiting for final resolution of some of the litigation that we faced from that last drought. So all of that was highlighted at the board's recent meeting. Importantly, we have to both walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're focusing on 2021 as a dry year. What's necessary in the short term? but we're also trying to integrate with the look over the horizon. And that's one place where we're getting better integration between the State Water Board and the Stewardship Council. You approved earlier today a contract extension for the Stewardship Council Science Enterprise to support the Water Board in updating its water quality control planning process. But we're also preparing comments right now from the Water Board back to the Council on the vulnerability assessment, which is out for public comment right now. So there are a lot of things that we're working on simultaneously with lots of different agencies throughout the watershed to get a better handle on this. Unfortunately, many of the tools that we're developing are not going to be practically available to us to manage during 2021 if it continues to be a dry year. So we're relying primarily on consultation and cooperative work with a lot of the people in the Delta and in the Delta watershed, who, after all, have done a lot of drought planning and really were quite instrumental in managing the drought in 2012-16.
I have a question. May I ask a question? I'm sorry.
Of course, Maria, sure.
Yes, my question is, these forecasts are on an annual basis, right? And is there a short-term and long-term forecast that you do? That's one question. And then the second question is, so if the tools, more advanced tools are not available to you, chances are that right now, all this forecasting happens through some empirical data. If that, or there are some methodologies that you feel like is solid enough to give you good results.
So we do have tools that we have used in prior droughts and that we are continuing to develop. And when I say some of the tools that particularly the visualization tool is currently focused on getting the bugs out in the Russian River watershed, and will be used this year in the Russian River to deal with and to help provide information to water users in that watershed. In the Delta watershed, we have not yet taken that tool, which is still in development, and applied it to the much more complex Delta watershed. Nonetheless, of course, we have tools that we have relied on in the past. One of the big issues with those tools is that a lot of the demand for water supply depends on user self-reports. And as I've described it in earlier reports to the council, we've really focused our user community in improving the consistency, the accuracy, and the timeliness of those reports. And I'll give you just one example that we're working on right now, which is to avoid duplicate reporting. I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But I didn't want to give you the impression that we don't have tools. I wanted to give you the impression that there are new tools in development that are not yet ready for rollout in the Delta watershed.
And these are annual forecasts.
In fact, even shorter than that, typically monthly time steps. In certain areas, they're even more acute than that. For instance, where we have specific issues with water supply for environmental purposes, critical parts of the watershed, places like Mill Creek up in Tehama County, where we really are trying to make sure that we maintain salmonid habitat in that critical area. So there are places where we've got really close in space and time analyses of supply and demand where we're trying to protect specific interests. But of course, those roll up into impacts Delta watershed wide. I'll get into a little bit more of that in my next slide. So let's go to the next slide if I've answered your question sufficiently.
Thank you very much.
So I want to talk about some of the specific drought initiatives affecting the Delta. So in my last slide, I was talking more about the entire Delta watershed, and I want to focus more on really my responsibility as Delta Water Master. and the emphasis on improving the data that we use in the Delta. So one thing that I've reported to this council before is the work that we've been doing really from 2016 on. One of the lessons learned from that last drought was the difficulty of the concept of overlapping riparian and pre-14 water rights. So we went to work on that. In late 2017, we finished essentially a legal analysis, a legal memorandum to discuss how we and the statutes in the state of California allow us to differentiate between riparian and pre-14 water rights. In 2018, we published that. We asked for feedback from the community. We've gotten a great deal of feedback, but I'm pleased to say that the legal principles described in that memorandum have held up very well through that process, and it has allowed us to reach better understanding with our water user community of how to differentiate riparian and pre-14 claims. In addition, just last year, we received the final judicial determination in the Tanaka case, which I mentioned in an earlier report to the council, but it really gave us a set of principles updated from prior court actions to tell us how to differentiate and how to describe and how to view riparian rights in an important part of the Delta. So we've been applying those principles ever since. One of the things that we have been able to do is settle 5 separate complaints, enforcement actions that had been outstanding for 10 years. We've been able to settle those rather than go to hearing, rather than continue with an enforcement process, largely by applying the principles from the Tanaka decision. We've also described this issue of duplicative reporting, where the same water molecules diverted from the same diversion for the same place of use, same purpose of use, are reported twice. Once in the reports of licensees for each island of the Delta, which typically is a separate reclamation district, which holds a license. And then those same diversions reported by senior water rights holders, either pre-14 water rights holders or riparians, later in a second report. So we've developed, through outreach to the community, a consensus approach to that so that all the water will be reported only once. We'll have a better sense of what the actual demand is, and it'll be reported primarily under the most senior water right. So we'll have a much better sense in applying our priority system of who has the highest priority, and it won't be masked by overlying reports of licensees, which of course generally have a more junior priority. So that's a consensus we hope to have inform all the reports that are issued in 2021 as to water use in 2020. In part of that, we've also decided to propose legislation to clarify and improve accuracy and timeliness in all our reporting. Because the reports were required in statute at different times for different reasons over time, we've now got a circumstance where different reports come in on different times, and even more importantly, they report on different periods. So we are pursuing legislation, asking for administrative support, which has not yet been provided through the review process, to get all reports to come in at the same time, early in the year, February of the year, but reporting on a uniform basis on the water year. That is the period from October 1st to September 30th. So report everything on a water year, get it all in by February. That way we'll have timely information that we can cross-reference and use to do the kind of planning we're doing right now without that data on a consistent basis for a coming drought period. So we're looking at fixing that, hopefully through some surgical statutory changes, which will bring all of those reports at the same time and all of them reporting on the same water year. So whether you're talking about surface water diversions under riparian, pre-14, or licensed rights, whether you're talking about groundwater extractions, whether you're talking about diversions to storage, get all of them to come at the same time, and all of them relate to the same water year so that you can use that data on an integrated basis to better plan for shortage. In addition, we've discovered that we've got some problems with the Water Board's own regulations. And so we're pursuing some, again, surgical fixes to our regulations to make them easier to understand and easier to comply with. And finally, we're relying on a lot of new technology. I described this before in terms of our use of OpenET, a way of measuring crop evapotranspiration, which we're rolling out first in the Delta to support a Delta alternative compliance plan under our regulations and Water Code Section 1840. So we're doing a lot of those specific initiatives in the Delta. If I go to the next slide, we're also recognizing that we've got to create drought management partnerships. Again, we're not talking about a top-down, what the Water Board or the Delta Water Master says about water availability. We're trying to form partnerships to manage collaboratively. So the first thing that we need to do is make sure we're not looking at or regulating or approaching the Delta as a monolith, as though it were a black box. And this graphic on the right side of the screen is important to focus on that. So the North Delta Water Agency, which includes large parts of Sacramento, Yolo, and Solano County, almost over a third, almost half of the Delta, operates under a water supply contract from the Department of Water Resources from the State Water Project, which basically acts as a security blanket, a wrap around the water rights in that part of the Delta. So this was negotiated in 1981, and under it, whether there's any infirmity in a local water right in the northern part of the Delta, this part indicated as the North Delta Water Agency, any shortage there is contractually made up by the State Water Project, so that essentially, because of that arrangement, there are no water rights enforcement issues for the Delta Water Master in that area. I don't want to suggest the North Delta is not cognizant of the shortage and not taking actions to reduce impacts on the entire water system, but it's important to understand that the North Delta has that contract. In addition, the Contra Costa Water Agency operates primarily to make diversions from the Delta under its contract with the United States Bureau of Reclamation. So again, that is focused not on senior water rights belonging to the Contra Costa Water District, although they have some. It's primarily a contractual management. Well, let me take a breath there because I think I see a question. I'm sorry, Councilmember Moranian, I thought you were about to ask a question. Okay, pardon me, I'll go on. In addition, a large part of Contra Costa, the East Contra Costa Irrigation District, similarly to North Delta, negotiated a contract in 1981 that similarly tracks that security blanket from the State Water Project. So my point is that large parts of the Delta, Byron Bethany Irrigation District, another good example in the southern part of the Delta, that has a portfolio that includes contractual obligations that are different from the direct diversion requirements that are prevalent, let's say, in the Central Delta Water Agency and the Southern Delta Water Agency. So we're really focusing on developing a variety of cooperative arrangements with agencies and enterprises and entities and water users in these distinct areas of the Delta, which recognize the fact that they are differently situated, both with respect to their water rights, the right to take water from channels in the Delta, and their ability to manage during the drought. We're also trying to focus much more attention than we did in 2012 to 16 on disadvantaged communities and environmental justice. And this goes to one of the big issues that was described in an earlier portion of today's meeting, which is the scourge of invasive species and harmful algae bacteria, which obviously impact water supply reliability, the usability and quality of water for use in the Delta and for export. But those impacts are disproportionately impacting disadvantaged communities, and particularly, again, focusing in a moment on the Southern Delta, where those harmful algae bacteria have created very significant and differentiated impacts on disadvantaged communities in the southern part of the Delta. One of our functions is to gather and to share this information so that people who are making their own decisions about how to operate in shortage conditions, or when a harmful algae bacteria bloom occurs, or where we get invasive species moving and impacting different areas of the Delta. So we're working on all of that. We're also partnering now with the California Water Data Consortium to help us put the data that we're gathering in formats that can be more usable, machine readable, accessible, recoverable with their metadata on a broader basis. And we're using our partnership with the California Water Data Consortium to assist us as we develop the Delta Alternative Compliance Plan. So those are the specific things we're doing. Now, quickly, next slide, I'll describe some of the specific responses in the Southern Delta. And I ran across this picture and I couldn't resist this poor young lady holding her nose and contemplating actually using the dock that she's got there to access the water, which is obviously impacted by harmful algae bloom. I'm not sure that picture's actually in the Delta. It may be a little bit outside of the Delta, but it gives you a visual of what kind of situation we ran into, particularly last summer in the southern part of the Delta, with this stinky green algae, which was dangerous for human contact and animal contact, and obviously not good for the ecosystem. So one of the things that we're doing is supporting efforts that came out of the first phase of the Water Quality Control Plan update in 2018, which was the requirement of developing a comprehensive operations plan in the southern part of the Delta to implement primarily the salinity issues, the salinity objectives in that water quality control plan. But because that comprehensive operation plan asks the federal Central Valley Project and the state water project to work on a comprehensive operations plan, there's embedded in that the notion of outreach. And I want to compliment both USBR and DWR on the comprehensive outreach efforts that they've done with folks like the South Delta Water Agency, the Contra Costa Water District, and other water users in the southern part of the Delta to really take advantage of the opportunity to think about not just the water project's impacts on water quality in the southern Delta, but to bring in those other users and to focus on a comprehensive operation planning process as a way of sharing ideas and solutions for a common problem. So in addition to just focusing on mitigation, the project's impacts on water quality in the southern Delta, to bring in those others to think cooperatively about how to address common problems beyond those impacts by the projects, and frankly, beyond the ability of the projects to manage those. So that's an important difference from the way we've approached this kind of thing in the past. And it's really brought on by the recognition that the updated biological opinions, the updated incidental take permit, focus more, as they are required to, on endangered species mitigation and moving more toward what Chair Tatayan often refers to as ecosystem approaches. How do we look more broadly at all the ecosystem issues. How do we bring together the resources to deal with them as common problems? That means the next bullet point here, using a multi-benefit prism as the way we look at the multiple stressors in the delta that all come together and interact with each other. And so we're really trying to use that multi-benefit, multi-stressor prism that I think is so advanced and empowered by what the Stewardship Council is doing with the One Delta One Science Initiative. So we're all in on that. And I'm pleased to have been part of the Technical Advisory Committee for your vulnerability assessment and working to bring the State Water Project, the Federal Central Valley Project, the State Water Board, and the Central and the Stewardship Council working together on these multi-problems. One of the worst problems in the Southern Delta, which I've described before, is the occlusion of delta channels through sedimentation. Particularly became acute in 2017 and 2019 when we had these big flows carrying lots of sediment that then slowed down in the Southern Delta, dropped that sediment, occluded the channels, created these multiple problems of warming the water, so bringing more HABs, reducing dissolved oxygen, making navigation more difficult, impacting water supply both within the Delta and for export. So we're expanding the ad hoc group that came together to focus on that. We had our first meeting with an external consultant to assist us with planning a process for dealing with that problem that'll involve lots of agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, our office, the Bay Delta unit of the Water Board, the state and federal export projects, the local water agencies, all of them coming together to develop a plan to actually deal with that problem, which threatens to occlude the channels such that they begin to eutrophy and we lose both ecosystem function and those other benefits that I mentioned. And finally, real time now, we've had exceedances of the new water quality salinity requirements in that 2018 update to the Southern Delta salinity objectives. And again, we're trying to work at this not as a your problem, you missed, you exceeded, instead trying to look at how it happened, what the impacts are. And even though it's unusual to have those exceedances in the wintertime, when we should have higher flows and less Southern Delta agricultural demand, in one sense, we're lucky to have these problems now because they aren't impacting the objective for which they were put in, that is Southern Delta agriculture, because we're not doing a lot of irrigation in the Southern Delta. We're doing mostly salt leaching during this period. But by identifying this now, bringing everybody together to look at the problem, I hope we'll be in a better position to manage it in the next month or 2 months when we start to get into the irrigation season and where we may continue to have these water quality problems. So those are the problems in the Southern Delta. Let's go to the next slide because that's really all I wanted to focus on today. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm very mindful that you've got a full agenda today and that I've kind of echoed some of the issues you've already heard in your executive director's report. So Chair Tatayan, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Looks like Maria and Don. I'll start with Maria, then go to Don. Questions?
You're on mute.
Mr. George, this was very, very helpful, and it always is. And I'm always forever thankful to you for the tour of the Delta and the boat, because we really came to understand the issues. And I'm just, referring back to what we saw in the Southern Delta in our tour and your report right now. And more in my work in water and water policy, I come across this whole issue of this ecological decisions cannot be made outside the context of the social fabric of what's going and economic, fabric of what's going on around them. And in that light, when you talked about the multi-benefit prism, I just would like to understand what is in there. And then if we are in our travels in water industry and the players and the different water communities, what is that we could say we're doing in terms of our assistance or our work in the South Delta? If you
So,
like, just give me, I know it's a bigger question, but it's conceptually, you can give me a sense of it.
of course, so a lot of the restoration activity that is going on in the Delta, that is very much supported by the Delta Science Initiatives and so forth, is taking place, understandably, in places where some restoration investment can make the biggest impact on ecosystem function, endangered species, survival, etc. That tends to be in the northern arc along the Yolo bypass, and maybe in the central Delta area leading out to the Chips Island and on past Sassoon Marsh and into the bay. It makes sense to do that. On the other hand, the most challenged area of the Delta is in the south, where it's harder to organize investment for ecosystem function because there are just so many competing demands and so many problems that are accelerating so rapidly. So a good example of that is this channel occlusion problem that I talked about. So in 2017, 2019, big flow years, when the water slows down in the southern Delta, so it's coming down the San Joaquin River at a high rate of speed, but then it hits the Delta and it spreads out, slows down, and drops that sediment. And what we found as a result of that is that you've got the sediment reducing the depth of these channels. So because the depths are lower, and in the summertime when it gets warm, the sun warms that water more rapidly. Number two, water doesn't move through those reaches as easily as it could. Big problem for flood control issues because those occluded channels won't carry as much water in the next big flow we have. So even though we're focused now on drought, we got to be cognizant of flood control. Because those channels are shallower, they're more hospitable to things like Egeria densa, an invasive weed that in shallow warm water attaches itself with a deep root system and further reduces the quality of water in the channel, makes it more difficult for fish to swim through it, reduces dissolved oxygen because it uses oxygen, as does water hyacinth. And obviously those channels won't carry as much water either to the export pumps or to the Southern Delta agricultural supply pumps. So all those problems come together and you can't solve them with a flood control problem or a levee management problem or deepening a well or something. It's a common problem. And frankly, we as regulators are part of the problem because we've created these very high regulatory burdens on channel maintenance because our regulations really don't differentiate between someone dredging a marsh to build a strip mall. We don't differentiate between that and dredging a channel to maintain its ecological water supply navigation functions. So it's one of the big things we're working on is so-called cutting the green tape. It's an initiative of the California Natural Resources Agency to make better decisions in the planning and permitting process to allow certain kinds of projects to go forward with appropriate ecological safety measures, but where the overall emphasis is on improving ecological function. And that's what I mean by looking at a multi-benefit prism to multi-stressor problem to bring multiple parties to the table, each with their own mission, their own resources, but to do something in common to solve a problem that is more extensive, more multifaceted, a more wicked problem, to use argot from the Stewardship Council, to bring all those to bear to actually make an impact. So that's what I was referring to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Supervisor.
Don?
McCoy?
Yeah, good morning, Michael. Good to hear your report again. And I wanted to follow up on the last bullet point you talked to was regarding the salinity exceedances. And just if you could just take just a brief moment, maybe in the nature of those, the duration, and were they just in the Southern Delta or were they elsewhere? And was there anything that, again, I think you addressed it, but was this an anomaly? Do you see it in this time of the year? And I'm just curious a little more about the nature of it, if you could explain.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. So it's at one monitoring point. It's a point on Old River, right where the Tracy Boulevard crosses Old River there. There's a monitoring station. In part because of occlusion in that channel, water in that area tends to slosh back and forth on the tides. There's not a lot of through flushing flows. So it is unusual to have salinity problems in the winter when we tend to have a lot of flows. But in that reach where there's occlusion in the channel, and because we had such a dry fall and early winter, we had our first exceedance, which was reported from that monitoring station on January 25th, where the 30-day average went above 1.0 EC, which is the salinity measurement in that area. So it's unusual to have it at that time, but I looked at it and said, well, it's not so unusual because we haven't had much flow. We looked at some of the other monitoring. We had about 850 CFS of flow on the San Joaquin River. That's relatively low for this time of year. We looked at it. We talked to the Department of Water Resources, which manages that monitoring station. And we talked through it. And we said at the time, okay, we were about to have a big precipitation event. Maybe that'll flush it out. We also recognized at that time that the same water was moving back and forth, and we identified a specific source of high salinity on one of the sloughs there. It's called Sugar Cut. So what we decided, and I recommended, and the water board and the executive director agreed, that we wouldn't take any action because of that exceedance. We'd wait and see what happened when we got that flow. And sure enough, we went from about 850 CFS on the San Joaquin to almost 2 weeks with 2,000 CFS. So there was a lot more fresh water coming into the Delta. However, we didn't see as much reduction in salinity at that monitoring station as I had anticipated. And sure enough, we got another indication on February 11th that the 30-day average had moved back above that 1.0. And so even though we'd had the big flows, and we were still suffering from this same water sloshing back and forth. And as we looked into the data, we also recognized that we had 2 more spikes in salinity coming down Sugar Cut. So it's given us, in combination with the water projects, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, our office, the Division of Water Rights, a good opportunity when we're not impacting Southern Delta agricultural diversions, but know we will in a month or 6 weeks when the diversion season, the irrigation season starts. We've got a chance now to try and look deeply into it, figure out what the problem is, look upstream on Sugar Cut, and see if we can figure out what's happening. So again, we're reaching out to all the parties of interest to try and get to the bottom of it so that we'll be better able to manage when irrigation season starts and where a spike like this could have more direct impact on Southern Delta agriculture.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate your explanation, and thanks for your good work always.
Thank you.
So one more question for you, Michael, from Daniel Zingali.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Mr. George, for being generous with your time and your knowledge. Very informative. Could you elaborate a little bit on how it is that the harmful algae bacteria disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities in the southern part of the Delta? And then any guidance for us on how the council can respond to that disproportionate impact? Is there anything we can do to lessen the burden on those communities?
So I appreciate the question. And I have to admit that I think, like a lot of us, we didn't appreciate the differential impact on disadvantaged communities as we started to focus more and more on these harmful algae blooms, which have been coming back more frequently and earlier as we have warmer temperatures and drier conditions. So last summer, if you happen to be in downtown Stockton, you would have seen that area where the Delta comes right into downtown Stockton there, past the port of Stockton. The green algae was thick, smelly, and we had multiple reports of people whose pets got in contact with it and either got very sick or died. But if you were down there looking at that, what you also noticed was that right along those waterways were homeless encampments and people who were using that Delta water to wash. Sometimes, even though they boil their water, they were using it to cook, and they were getting sick. So that's the most easily seen and understood disadvantaged community. It's the people who are forced to camp along these waterways. And in fact, just in late December, I was out in the Delta in a boat going south from Sacramento and taking pictures of the homeless encampments along the Sacramento River, including one that is right on the riverside of the Pocket, and which had excavated into the levee, created essentially a basement with a tent over it as a living space for seriously disadvantaged individuals. But recognize that that also creates a huge risk to the community in the Pocket area of, urban Sacramento. The next time we have very high flows on the Sacramento River, that water is going to chisel into that area and potentially compromise the safety of that levee. So the problems of disadvantaged communities are much more understood as impacting all of us. And that's what I meant by the differential impact of these issues on disadvantaged communities. And it is in the city of Stockton, but it is also in other areas in the Southern Delta where people live in close proximity to Delta water and are impacted by these harmful algae blooms or by these invasive species. Now, you've also got what I wouldn't call a disadvantaged community, but Discovery Bay is heavily impacted by these kinds of problems. So what we're recognizing is that, yes, the impact is differential on disadvantaged communities, and our environmental justice requirements, our moral obligations, are to look more carefully at them. So what can we do? Monitor more carefully, identify when we can get better flows into those areas, how we can manage flows that are developed for other purposes positively impact that. And one project that is ongoing right now that should have an impact in that area in Stockton is redirecting Cosumnes River flow into Mormon Slough, which empties into that turning basin in Stockton, which should have the effect, when there are flows in that area, to move some of that water out, to flush some of it, to reduce those impacts. But honestly, the biggest thing you can do to improve the Southern Delta is to open up the channels and to drive more water through those channels. Those are the big impacts.
Thank you very much for that clear answer, and especially for recognizing that it's part of your job to go there and bear witness to the effect on these communities. I really appreciate your going down and seeing the people who are most impacted and reporting back to us and others. Thank you.
Well, and so one thing I would say in response to that, Councilmember Zingale, is just as Councilmember Moranian talked about her boat trip, I'd invite you and Councilmember Smith, as soon as we can safely do it, it is useful to be on the Delta waters. You can see a lot of the Delta from Delta levee roads and so forth, but you appreciate it differently when you're on the water. So once we all get vaccinated, you got that to look forward as well.
I highly
Thank you. I
recommend it.
accept that invitation.
Very
I welcome it.
Especially with Mr. George.
Thank you. Well, Chair Tatayan, as usual, I've taken more time than you've allotted me. I apologize, but I'm really pleased to have been with you today, and look forward to continuing the process of bringing the various agencies together on the important work that the council is responsible for under the Delta Plan.
No worries, Michael. We always benefit from your very thorough reports, and as Daniel said, I really appreciate your being out there on the ground. And I can't think of very many people who are on the ground and with the agencies and with the stakeholders and at the water board hearings and reporting to us. And thank you for your dedication.
Thank you.
Well, if there is no public comment, are there any public comments, Brandon?
No public comment.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. Good to see you. On to agenda item 8, overview of the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool. And Jessica Pearson will be giving us some context.
Thank you, Chair. Today with us, we have representatives from the San Francisco Estuary Institute Aquatic Science Center, and they are here to provide an overview of the recently developed and council-funded Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool. The tool was actually a hot topic at our recent Adaptive Management Forum. We had large attendance at both of the workshops that focused on its use. So now I'd like to introduce Karen Fitz, Environmental Program Manager of the Delta Science Program, and she will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Good morning, council members. It's been a while since I addressed you. And there are some new faces on the council. Welcome, Christy. So as Jessica said, I'm Karen Fitz. I'm the Adaptive Management Program Manager for the Delta Science Program, and I'm actually pleased this week to be celebrating my 6th anniversary working at the council. So today you'll be hearing about the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool, an effort that's funded by the council and developed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. My colleagues Letitia Grenier and Lydia Vaughn from the San Francisco Estuary Institute will be giving a slide presentation describing the tool in detail in a moment. First, I'll give you just a brief introduction. So the council has been investing in this tool, scoping and development since 2018. The initiative stems from a desire to be able to relatively quickly design and compare multiple possible restoration scenarios, and then compare the effects of those restoration scenarios on ecological and economic indicators. The tool enables collaborative, transparent, and stakeholder-driven explorations of different restoration scenarios. Scoping for the tool involved a series of workshops with agencies and organizations active in delta restoration and land management. Based on the needs of the council and other entities, the council funded the development of the base tool and a prioritized set of analytical modules. Other modules that build upon the base tool have been funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Delta Conservancy. In an amendment last October, the council committed to funding 2 additional priority modules, expanding the tool coverage to include the Sassoon Marsh, and making improvements to a few existing modules in order to, among other objectives, better inform the Delta Plan Chapter 4 amendment process, performance measures, and Delta Adapts. So I'll hand it off now to Dr. Grenier to tell you more about the tool. Dr. Grenier co-directs SFEI's Resilient Landscapes program, where she and her team developed the Delta Landscapes projects, which quantify landscape performance and provide science to support large-scale restoration visions for the region. Her work is focused on conserving California's resources by developing landscape-scale, collaborative, science-based visions and solutions. Welcome, Dr. Grenier.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here presenting to this group today. It's nice to see new folks here. Some of you have met me in the past. I want to start out by saying I'm not very good at the formal language of the council, and I remember in particular referring to the council as you guys once. So I just apologize in advance if I do that. What I mean to say is most esteemed council members, but I'm not used to it. So I want to start by connecting this work to the bigger issues that we face. I think as we're all aware, we're facing a global crisis in terms of climate change and getting ecosystems to work in a way that that helps people. And there's also a biodiversity crisis. David Attenborough, who you may know, the most famous naturalist on the planet, that British broadcaster, yesterday reported to the United Nations Security Council that climate change is the biggest threat to security that modern humans have ever faced. If we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security: food production, access to fresh water, habitable ambient temperatures, and ocean food chains. And if the natural world can no longer support the most basic of our needs, then much of the rest of civilization will quickly break down. And I don't say that to try to create, panic or something, but just to remind us that, like, often I'm got heads down trying to get my projects done, very busy dealing with my family and my work life. But really, we are at the heart of this crisis. We are the troops on the ground that are doing this. And I want to explain why. It's because we're working in a critical ecosystem. So the kind of things that David Attenborough is talking about is important in places with high biodiversity. Check, we have that. Super important ecosystem services, we have that. And if you look at any review papers on ecosystems on the planet, estuary and wetlands, which is what the Delta was historically and what we're talking about restoring parts of it to, are the most valuable ecosystem on the planet. They do climate change mitigation, they do climate change adaptation, they help with water quality and food production. They are really important for protecting the shoreline now, especially with sea level rise. And they provide us places to recreate and be in nature, as well as supporting our native biodiversity. So I just don't want us to forget that even though we're all so busy and this is such a challenging problem, what we're doing is really important. And it's important both in terms for people and for the environment. We all are aligned with this. And I think David Attenborough said it really well. These threats do not divide us. They are the threats which should unite us, no matter from which part of the world, and I'm going to add this, or which sector of the Delta we are from, for we all face these threats. So I think there is a way to find alignment in the challenges we're facing, and the tool I'm going to talk to you about is intended to do just that. Okay, so I think, next slide, please, Brandon. Karen gave you a good introduction to the tool. This tool is really about trying to get a full view of all the functions that we want the Delta ecosystem to provide, both for people and for wildlife, or for nature, whichever way you like to think of it. And so it's a tool that provides a science-based, quantified measure of what the landscape would do under different scenarios. And by what the landscape would do, I mean how much agricultural return would it provide? How much would it support native fish? How much carbon would it store? What would the elevations be? So these are the kinds of critical things that you all have been talking about for years and that we're all trying to figure out, how do we put these things together to make a sustainable delta into the future? And the point of this tool is that it can do that over large spatial scales or at the island scale, but you can look at this across the entire delta and try to put together those multiple benefits that you're trying to get out of the landscape and weigh them against each other and understand their trade-offs. And by trade-offs, I mean things like, okay, here we have an area that we're going to restore. It's almost at intertidal elevation. Should we let it fill up with sediment by itself, or should we fill it, which will be a lot more expensive, but that will give us a tidal marsh much sooner? Or maybe if we're in a deeper part of the delta, we're thinking, well, should I turn this into a managed marsh and get carbon revenue for it? Or should I try to grow rice here and have a different kind of revenue? And so this tool is intended to actually help people make those decisions, but with way more measurements than that, because there are so many things we're trying to trade off here. And if you think about it, it's a way to give everybody a seat at the table. So if all the stakeholders or sectors can have their issue measured and visualized in this tool, then they essentially have a seat at the table, so that anytime a planner sits down and says, I'm going to think about what to do in this place or that place, or how all these different projects add up to getting us toward the Delta Plan ecosystem amendment performance measures, they have to see all of those measurements. So if there's somebody who only cares about bass fishing and we have a bass fishing metric in here, then bass fishermen or bass fishers are then represented. Or if it's agricultural economics, or if it's supporting salmon, it's a way that all the sectors are kind of at the table even when they can't be physically there. Their interests are represented and visualized in this tool. And it's a way at getting at equity. And I think with the EJ presentation you're going to get later, the more we figure out what we need to do to support local communities and frontline communities and disadvantaged communities, we can put those needs and interests into this tool and have those be part of this full view that we're trying to get. And I think it's important to note that this is a science-based tool. What I'm going to show you here is actually really deeply grounded in scientific literature. It's the best available science. It's been peer reviewed. We've been working on it for many years. So it's not, there's no combat science represented here. It's a lot of folks from government institutions and academic groups that have been a part of building this, along with our staff at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through a bit of the problem statement. What can this tool do? And then I'll show you how it works. And then we'll talk about where it's headed in the future. And hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions still. So one of the big needs here is for regional restoration planning, which in my mind is, how do we put the ecosystem back together? We've done a lot of alteration to the Delta ecosystem. I've talked to you about that before and you're well aware of it. And now we're having some real challenges coming. How do we put it back together enough that it gives us the functions that we really need it to do? So we can use this tool to construct scenarios, future scenarios of restoration and land use, and then evaluate them for those functions that we are each interested in from any sector who can bring their metric to the table. And then we can look at the cumulative impacts of multiple projects. And that's really important. As I've heard folks say from CalTrout, random acts of restoration do not put ecosystems back together. You need to think about how the pieces add up to a puzzle. Or the way I like to think of it is, you can't just randomly throw a bunch of car parts in a pile and think you're going to have a vehicle that functions. You need to understand what you're trying to build, and then everybody has to build their piece so that the system is functional. Next slide. And this can really help with implementing the Delta Plan. So this tool can promote and assist with compliance. We're kind of setting a target with this tool. Like, here's the kind of thing that we want your projects to do. And that's going to help pre-align the projects that come in so that they're more in compliance with the Delta Plan. And then we can actually anticipate progress toward the performance measures in the ecosystem amendment and perhaps other parts of the plan. And then also measure whether or not track that progress as the projects are actually implemented on the ground in real life. Next slide. It's also a way to think about, how do we spend the money? Which projects do we want to be put in where? So when you're evaluating proposals, this can be useful. And we've heard this from the Delta Conservancy, that this could be a valuable tool for them as they think about how to dole out their grant money. Next slide. And then tracking. Once projects are actually in the ground, how is the ecosystem progressing? Is it doing the things that we wanted it to do? Do we need to update some of our science? So it's sort of a full picture analysis from the planning phase to implementation, and then tracking how well we did. Next slide. And of course, that's important for the ecosystem amendment performance measures, as I said before. So what is this work based on? I'm going to show you how it works, and there's going to be a piece that's like, and then it goes into the machine and the sausage is made. And I want to tell you that the sausage is made using a lot of science that we worked on for about 10 years at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. You've seen me present on this before if you were around back then in this group. We did a lot of work trying to understand the historical delta. How did it used to work? Then we looked at the landscape now. How does it work now? And these are things like basic physical processes of flooding, movement of sediment, of water, of plants and animals, and then understanding that change and the natural template that is left in terms of topography and climate and flows. How should that inform the future delta? And all of that science and knowledge, which was again peer reviewed, has been put into this tool in the background where you don't see it to make it easier, but that's how we measure those metrics. We measure them using the science that's out there in the literature, and that our advisors helped us determine is as good as it can be. And I think what was different about this work that we call the Delta Landscapes Project is that it was landscape scale. It was broadly, it was thinking well beyond the project across the whole Delta. We talked about process-based restoration. So not highly managed projects, that's not the goal. The goal is actually trying to get nature to do the work for us without having to spend a lot of money or management on it. It's not possible to totally do that, but that is the ideal, is to try to make it as efficient as possible by using natural processes. And then we're driving toward those ecosystem functions. And that doesn't just mean for nature or for wildlife, that means for people too. We're all reliant on these ecosystem functions, no matter how we derive our, no matter what interests we are representing in this as we come to the Delta planning. And then it helped us think holistically. So this is way beyond flows and fish. And at the risk of being unpopular, I'll say, I think that Delta planning and the way that money has been spent has been too focused on flows and fish for too long. And there's great reasons for that. I understand why that's happened, but we may have been able to move the needle faster if we thought about wetland restoration and large scale, more holistic ecosystem function. And that is something that came out in a paper that Jeff Mount of the Public Policy Institute of California published about a year ago on where should we go with freshwater ecosystems in California. So this work, I think, helped us think more holistically. It provided some of that scientific foundation to think about benefits to wildlife and people, and how do we connect to the watershed above us and the rest of the watershed below us. And then it was intended to help us think more large scale and long term. And that also included thinking about climate change. Next slide. So here's the tool itself. What is this thing? It's basically, you have to download it from the web to use it. So at the moment, it's not something you can go online and play with. But if you have the software and the expertise, you download where essentially a bunch of maps, and then you can add your own maps of what are these different future land uses I want to look at, or what are the 3 different project alternatives I'm trying to compare for this island, things like that. You can either do it at the large scale or at a small project scale. And then inside the tool, which is a bunch of spatial analysis or measuring these maps in different ways, it measures what those different future scenarios would look like in terms of returning the expected functions they would return. So you get back a summary of the functions, you get back habitat types, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. And then that is output in a report, essentially, that you can see online or that you can download as a PDF. So it's intended to take like all these different data sets that are very complicated and require a lot of, you have to find them and then you kind of have to massage them so that you can compare them properly. It runs them through that science sausage making thing that I was talking about. I call that's where the magic happens in the back end of all this ArcGIS programming. And then it outputs what decision makers are interested in. How much fish support would I get back in this scenario? How much agricultural, what would the state of the agricultural economy be? Is this even feasible in terms of the elevations that are there? How would this impact carbon, et cetera? And so the current metrics that are in the tool are how much of each habitat type there is, how much support for marsh wildlife, for riparian wildlife, and for fish. So you can see that a lot of the origin of the work was based in thinking about restoration of ecosystem functions for wildlife. But we've also got a module in there on inundation, where does the flooding happen? And this again relates to those performance measures I keep mentioning. How does it affect subsidence? How does it affect agriculture, infrastructure? Where is the restoration happening, or the land use change happening? Is it on protected areas or private land? And then are those places physically suitable? And that's part of where the climate change comes in, is thinking about where elevations are at and where it's appropriate to do different kinds of actions. So that's where the tool's at now. But as I was saying before, this is a modular tool that the council has invested in. So we can add things in to represent different sectors as we learn more about what people want to see coming out of the future Delta landscape. Just make sure I didn't forget anything. I think that's it. So again, we're taking the complex information, running it through the tool and getting back this output. So it's intended to be one-stop shopping, to have this broad view of many stakeholders at the table. Next slide. And this is just a view of what you get out of the tool. If you look at it in the web page format, you'll get what you see on the right here in the box. And so you can see there are maps and tables and graphs, and you can compare up to 3 scenarios, and you can compare them to the current situation and the historical delta. And what I'm going to show you today is looking at the eco-restore scenario of DWR. So a lot of the restoration that's been planned and implemented or is going to happen soon is in this scenario. And you can see this, we're looking at a marsh patch size metric within the marsh module. And you can see that eco-restore is really going to create some larger marshes. That orange bar is much higher than what the modern average patch size is. Next slide. And you also get a summary of all of the different metrics when you print out or when you get your output from the tool. And this is just to show you that you can compare them really quickly side by side in a table. I'm going to talk a lot about modules and metrics. And what I mean by that is a module is sort of a general topic. And the one I'm showing you here is support for marsh wildlife, but it has many metrics within it. Each of those rows is a different way of measuring support for marsh wildlife. And each one is based on the scientific literature of what matters. So the thresholds that are chosen here, like our marsh patches greater than 100 hectares or greater than 500 hectares, those have real functional meaning in terms of what we're going to get back for making the investment of getting those kind of features onto the landscape. Next slide. And this is looking at graphs across many of those marsh metrics. So you can see that eco-restore, the orange bar, really improves some metrics, but others not so much. And so this is the kind of trade-off thing you can start to think about. Okay, well, if I'm interested in this metric and not that one, which of these scenarios is important to me? Next slide. And now we're going to look at the module, just one of the metrics within the module on supporting native fish, because I think it shows you why the spatial aspect of this is really important. Here's the historical delta, one big marsh. Next slide. And now what we're going to look at here is the distance to the nearest large wetland. So if you focus on green, those are the large wetlands, and large wetlands are really important to native fish because they're places where there's low water velocity, they can hide, there's places to hide, and they can hang out and eat and get fat. And that's what they need to survive, of course, but if you're a small salmon exiting the delta, it really improves your survivorship if you can become a big fat baby salmon before you get all the way to the ocean. So having some wetlands to hang out in and grow is really key for salmon, but they need to basically do that every night. They can swim a little bit in the day, and then every night they need a place to hang out and eat and be safe so they can survive until the next morning and then continue on their journey. And so what you can see here is that the eco-restore scenario, next slide, it adds some of that green. Will you go back and forth a little bit, Brandon, so we can see the change in that green? So it adds green, but it doesn't really add it in new places. It's going to put in new big wetlands, but it's not going to help with this migration problem. So if you've got a fish that's trying to leave the delta, it still has to run these really long gauntlets of places where there's nowhere safe to hang out at night before the next place to rest and recover. So this helps you see that eco-restore is really important, but doesn't hit every metric that's critical to restoring salmon. And these kind of displays and metrics can help us understand that at the big landscape scale. Next slide. I'm going to quickly show you a couple of others. So there's also a module on subsidence that helps think about how that's going to change. Clearly, incredibly important to know what's going to happen with elevations in the delta in terms of, I won't even get into it. We don't have time, but you're all well aware. You know, water quality, salinity intrusion, the cost to maintain levees, et cetera. Next slide. We can also look at how different land use plans impact agriculture. This is looking at which crops and how many acres of agriculture are impacted by the entire eco-restore scenario. And it impacts slightly less than 2% of the agriculture in the Delta, mostly pasture, to implement these eco-restore projects. So it's nice to be able to quantify that and understand the impact. Next slide. Part of the tool is an interactive web map. So I said the tool's mostly for people who can download it and run the program called ArcGIS. But right now you can actually get online and explore the data. So if you're a member of the public or someone who's kind of planning future scenarios, you could get in there and play with this, which is really nice. Next slide. Okay, we do have current updates that are funded by the Delta Stewardship Council. So our new analyses, this is all based on outreach that we've already done, and I think Karen talked about this a little bit, to hear what was important to stakeholders. So we're doing a bunch of work partly funded by CDFW on carbon and greenhouse gas net change in emissions, and also carbon market revenue and elevations. So that's all one big bundle. My colleague Lydia Vaughn, who's actually running this project, is a carbon scientist. And so she's bringing a lot of expertise so that we can do this. We're doing a new module on economics, as Karen mentioned. And then we're also looking at wetland resilience through this other CDFW project, but it ties into, we can really leverage these other projects now because it's a modular tool, and bring new modules in from other projects at a relatively inexpensive price. So that's helping fund this with other agencies' resources. And we're also starting to expand the spatial coverage to include Sassoon. So that's really key, so that the entire, what I think of as the solution space for the Delta Stewardship Council, will be covered by this tool. So we can think holistically across that whole arc of habitat and ecosystem to think about what needs to be done. And then I kind of glossed over, but in terms of wetland resilience, we really think this work is going to help support the Delta Adapts adaptation phase that's coming up. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of my talk. I guess one thing I want to touch on then, we also have a pretty big outreach task here in this current grant. And it's really important, because the tool is new, to get out there and hear who's using it, see how we can support them, understand where the problems are and what new modules we want to have added. And we're really hoping that one of the things we can get is more input from communities. What are the community metrics that people who live, work, and play in the Delta want to see in here, both from disadvantaged communities and just from other local communities? So I'm excited about the work that the council is doing on that, and the report you're going to hear today, and hopefully we can start to build that in over time. Next slide. We recently had the 2 big workshops that were mentioned earlier at the Adaptive Management Forum. There was a lot of excitement from people. The tool's really new, so we didn't hear yet, like, I'm using the tool for X, Y, and Z, but what we heard was, I would like to use the tool for many different kinds of things. People even wanted it for other geographies besides the Delta and Sassoon. There were about 60 people from 25 organizations who attended and were trained in how to use the tool. And then it was interesting, there were both managers and staff level folks. So people who were never going to use the tool, but were going to use the results that came out of it. And the people who were actually going to run the tool were there. And I think one of the really interesting things that we have to do now is a lot of follow up with those folks to support them. And so with the momentum we've gained here, try to get more users involved in the tool. And then hopefully that will bring in more funding to keep developing it over time. Next slide. So what we've heard from folks that they want to do with this is evaluate proposals for funding as we expected, plan restoration design alternatives, and we presented one of those example of how it could be used for that about Frank's tract, and then track progress toward performance measures, especially those in the Delta plan. But the big vision that I think is the opportunity here, which I mentioned before, is to make this a really inclusive tool that can help us design a resilient, just, and sustainable future Delta. So as we're going through the Delta Adapts adaptation phase, for example, we can use this tool to think about what are the landscape mosaics of different kinds of land use that can get us to that place. On the edges of the Delta, there may be some places where we want to restore those intertidal marshes that provide so many really important ecosystem functions. In the middle of the Delta, where it's so subsided, maybe we have a mosaic of managed marshes that help produce carbon revenue. We pump the water out over the levee and that feeds fish. They're helping to gain elevation and reduce the stress on the levees. And then other places we have more rice. And if there are places that we can't do dryland agriculture anymore, maybe we can start to change some policies so we can have more wetland agriculture. You know, I've heard Dawit Zalek at the Nature Conservancy talk about trying to grow water chestnuts or buffalo for mozzarella cheese making. There are places in the rest of the world where people still use wetlands for agriculture. And I think having that kind of flexibility, we can play around with that in this tool and it's not going to cost us a lot. We don't actually have to convert any land. So it's a really powerful way to help us as a community involved in thinking about the future Delta, move toward a multi-benefit framework that really takes into account the functions that all different stakeholders and sectors are interested in. And we can think about those trade-offs of functions over space and time. in the safe space of a planning tool rather than on the ground. And we can manage at the system scale so that we get that car functioning as it should, instead of having kind of random acts across the landscape that don't add up to as much as they should. Next slide. With that, I want to say thank you so much for listening, and I hope there's still time for questions.
Thank you, Letitia. Council members, any question for Dr. Grenier? I think, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thanks, Madam Chair. I just, one thing occurred to me, and thanks, Letitia, for your presentation. I'm curious, and you mentioned, got in the onset about if someone who was interested in fishing, they could use the tool and so forth, but how does the recreational component get built into this? I know certainly as the Delta Protection Commission, we have, multiple charges, but certainly, the recreational aspect is important. So how does this get factored into the layering here when you use the tool, or is it built into other components?
It's not fully programmed in yet. As you saw, there's those metrics that are currently available and others that are being produced. There's a small item in what we're currently funded to do to improve the CPAD database. So to be able to understand where recreational land use is currently happening. There are problems with that database, and so it's kind of wrong. So we're trying to fix a lot of places that it's wrong, using community input to do that. But what I think we really need is to either get through a new process or through some of what you may already be doing, an understanding of how do people, what is it they want? Do they want to have a certain, like really great bass fishing spots next to boat ramps? Or, what are the different elements spatially that we've got to get right? Because I know that after a certain distance, it's too far to take your boat. You can't get out there in a day and come back. So that was some of the issue that was the issue with some of the Frank's track designs. It was going to really mess up some of the navigation. So essentially it is enough resources, or if somebody can hand us that information, we can just program that in. We can add another module, but we're currently not funded to do that. And it almost made the cut last time when we were trying to figure out what we could fit into the budget that we had, but I think recreation just barely didn't. And Karen may be able to speak to that more, but it is something that people have talked about a lot and we know needs to be added over time.
And I would just note too, I think that it's not just water-based. Obviously, there's land-based recreation, and it ties in certainly to the economics, social aspects of communities and towns, and so I think there as people are looking at the multiple benefits, seem to me that would be useful information. And you've said as such. It's just that it hasn't gotten built into the model yet, and I may have our executive director from the Delta Protection Commission, Eric Bink, follow up with you. Maybe you've talked with Eric, but I think that some of the work that the commission has done, obviously that is consistent with the Delta plan and so forth. I think it might be helpful if if there's a way to over time to get that built into the considerations as well. So
that would be really welcome. Having that kind of information, I think, helps us write the next proposal.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is one of the strengths of this tool is its modularity. So the council funded the development of the base tool in such a way that other modules can be added on in their own separate scopes of work. And so we've already seen that with some of our sister agencies funding discrete modules based on their interests. But this is something that any agency or organization could come to the table. And I think the hardest part, that foundational work for recreation, as Letitia was saying, is that we don't have all the information that we need in order to make that robust. And so there's an outreach and stakeholder engagement component. And that's actually probably the more costly and time-consuming part of this process relative to the analytical work that it would take to then build that information into the tool.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Letitia or Karen? Christy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was a great presentation. I love things like this. I think it's so incredibly exciting anytime that you can make data accessible and usable for folks in the public policy space. But Karen, you just touched on my question a little bit. First of all, it's just, writ large, what do you anticipate about the end user universe? How many folks, how diverse across the region? And then secondarily to that, because sometimes there's benefit to be gained from just the questions that are being asked, does the software have the capacity to be tracking then what people are exploring in terms of their research and the projects they're looking at?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways of looking at who the users of the tool are. So there are users of the tool who will directly interact with it, and then there are users who will interact with the outputs. And I think that of the users that will directly interact with the tool, we know for sure there are staff within several agencies that will directly be interacting with the tool. Council staff for sure. This much of the scope has been tailored specifically for the analytical needs of evaluating Delta Plan ecosystem chapter performance measures and the underlying analysis that's necessary for the Delta Adapts adaptation phase. And so there are users within the council that can use it for that. Also, my staff who work on supporting adaptive management for restoration and water management projects will be direct users of the tool and can help partner with other agencies and organizations that are trying to plan and implement restoration projects so that they can evaluate different scenarios and use it as a tool to inform the discussions around trade-offs between different possible restoration scenarios. Similarly, there are staff at the Delta Conservancy, staff at California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who are already known direct users of the tool. And Letitia and Lydia are probably aware of many other users that I'm not even listing who participated in that in the trainings that we did at the Adaptive Management Forum. 25 different organizations that attended. So there are those direct users, but then I think about who benefits from hearing about these outputs. And the council for sure is one of the audiences that benefits, but I think also the Conservancy, the Protection Commission, and a wide variety of Delta landowners and stakeholders are going to be hearing about analyses that are done in this tool and the outputs, and whether it's at a council meeting or a commission meeting, or whether it's in the context of a specific workshop, a public engagement on Delta Adapt's adaptation strategy, for example, there's going to be a huge audience of people who are going to be informed by the clarity of these outputs and being able to visualize and understand what the trade-offs are. So those are my thoughts on the user base.
Are there other questions? I do have a question, either Letitia or Karen. I'm imagining that this tool and the science tracker and the performance measures dashboard or will soon be integrating. Is that the case? And I don't mean soon. I don't know what soon is, given funding and capacity. But I'm just curious if that's a current objective.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the Delta Science Tracker part of it. I'm not aware of how that could or couldn't integrate with this. But I think in terms of performance measures, we've worked very closely with the performance measures team in the development of this tool to ensure that the work that we're doing, not only to develop the tool, but also Letitia spoke to some of the work that happens is actually cleaning up underlying data sets in transforming them so that they're more usable for analysis within the tool, but can also be more usable for analysis for things such as the performance measures. And so those processes have been happening in a complementary fashion to ensure that, to the extent possible, the tool can directly be used to analyze and inform performance measures, and that the tool improvements are being made in such a way that they best inform the Delta Plan performance measures. So I think there's a lot of synergy between those, the way that we'll be reporting out in the future about performance measures, and the work that we're currently putting into this tool development.
Great, great. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have one last question, if I may. We talked about process-based restoration, which is the nature-based solutions in a way. I'm wondering what percent from your analysis and data and scientific research that you've done, what percent of these measures could really be process-based in terms of all the restorative work?
Yeah, I think that's
majority.
I think it's a great question. I think that's socially and in terms of some physical situations in the Delta, very challenging. Around the edge of the Delta, there's actually lots of land that's at the right elevation for process-based restoration, but it's also very valuable for agriculture because it's at the right elevation, right? So elevation to me is everything in the Delta, and that creates just an inherent conflict. I think it's going to be a question of how much land at that elevation do we want to be tidal marsh? That is where we have the opportunity for the greatest amount of fully natural process-based restoration. But I don't think it actually ends there. It's not a green-gray situation here. When you can't have full natural processes, what we have tended to do is, in the SDR and science community, is think about, well, where can you mimic them? And there's so many natural processes you can mimic partly. So let's say you have a managed marsh in the middle of the Delta. You have to manage it. You have to manage the water levels. You're using it to get some carbon revenue money. It's building up an elevation over time. It's helping reduce the levee pressure. It's helping, reduce the levee maintenance costs. So those are all, it's helping ensure that the flows go in the right direction and remain fresh water. So it's doing all kinds of good things that way. But then you've got a food web going inside, right? So you have a whole ecosystem inside of that levied marsh that's feeding wildlife. The birds can get there. The marsh fish, the fish can't get in there. But you could pump the water out over the edge. This is something Campbell Ingram talks about a lot about. You pump the water over the levee, and then you're feeding the fish in the channels outside of that marsh. There's a lot of natural process in there. That entire food web, the marsh accreting and making peat for itself, there's tons of natural process, but you're also having to partly manage it. So that's on the spectrum, maybe somewhere in the middle of a nature-based solution. And then when you're building a straight up seawall that's vertical and it's made out of concrete, that is 100% gray engineered. And so the more we can move all of our solutions toward the green, assuming that within the Delta especially, we're going to have a lot of that middle space, the more benefits we're going to get out of it. And the reason that is because nature-based solutions, and there's a lot of new research on this, they have way more bang for the buck. You get way more kinds of benefits coming out of them in the way that I just talked about, those layered benefits. And those ecosystems also tend to be more resilient and adaptive, so they can cope better with climate change than that seawall or that levee in the Delta. We have these levees that ultimately will not be able to be engineered to withstand the amount of water that's going to be pressing on them unless we can do something about the elevation inside the levee. Does that answer your question sufficiently? Even though I can't put a real number on it? Yeah,
totally. Because, we deal with this issue like nature-based solutions in stormwater a lot. I work with a lot of stormwater. In some areas you can, in some places you can't. I have a feeling that there is more you can do in the Delta than we can do in the stormwater, just because of hearing about the possibilities that you have on more process-based restoration. Yes, thank you. You answered me.
Doing a lot of work on trees and stormwater, so we can come talk to you about that in a separate moment. There are some nature-based solutions there, but I think it's again that spectrum of green-gray.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions for Letitia or Karen, I want to thank you both. This is a great presentation, very exciting, and it definitely furthers movement toward freshwater ecosystem-based management. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say this project is really important. I've been doing estuarine science for 20 years, and this one has more excitement around it than many things I've seen. So I want to thank you for making this possible. And thanks for getting to talk to you today.
Certainly.
Thank you.
So on to agenda item 9, update and public comment on the Delta Adapts public review draft vulnerability assessment. And Jessica will kick things off.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the public review draft of the climate change vulnerability assessment was released last month, and it's available now for public comment and review through March 16th. As part of the comment period, the council staff today will provide a very quick overview of the draft, and then we want to open it up to public comment and have the opportunity for people to provide comments directly to the council while the comment period is still open. So here with us today is Harriet Ross, and she's going to provide our update. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, Chair Tatayan and members of the council. Again, I'm Harriet Ross, Assistant Planning Director in the Planning and Performance Division. Next slide, please. As Jessica mentioned, I'll be giving you a brief update on the council's climate change study, Delta DAPS, today, specifically covering the Drought Vulnerability Assessment, a recent community workshop, and the Adaptation Strategy. And then we'll end with hearing public comments on the Drought Vulnerability Assessment. Next slide. If you recall, we reviewed the preliminary vulnerability assessment findings at the November and December council meetings. Since then, we released the public draft vulnerability assessment in mid-January. And based on request by the public, we did extend the comment period to a full 60 days. And that comment period ends on March 16th. Any comments can be emailed to the address shown on the slide there. And we plan on finalizing the vulnerability assessment sometime in this spring, and we'll be bringing it forward to you at that point. Next slide. I want to give you a quick update on the virtual workshop we held earlier in the month. We teamed with 4 community-based organizations who helped us plan and design this workshop specifically for the Stockton community. It was led by youth representatives, ranging from high school students to college graduates. We started off the workshop with the staff reviewing key findings of the vulnerability assessment at the meeting, and then we went into breakout groups where the youth reflected on those findings and provided feedback on the vulnerability assessment itself. There were 4 groups where we discussed the climate hazards of drought, flooding, wildfires, and extreme heat. We received positive feedback from our community partners in the workshop, and I thought it was really powerful, especially with the youth representation. Chair Tatayan, council members Ngali, I know you two were in attendance and didn't know if you wanted to share your thoughts on how you thought the workshop went.
Well, I thought the workshop went really well, and the level of engagement was really inspiring, especially from the youth from the various Delta organizations. It was quite clear that they read the draft, they dissected it, they created these very visual presentation slides focused on their specific area of interest and concern. And hats off to the team for working to really reach out to these folks and get them engaged. And I was really pleased to hear some of the comments from the stakeholders. So thank you.
Yeah, this is Daniel. My experience was the same. I was in the drought breakout group, and everything Susan just said about the youth was true there too. And sometimes all of this, the truth about climate change can weigh heavily on our spirits. And just being in the presence in that workshop of these young people with their intelligence and optimism and engagement really helped restore some of my faith in the future. So I hope we'll do more of that.
Thank you. I hope so too. I hope we'll be able to do more of that as well. Okay, and then moving on to the next slide. As was previously mentioned, we launched a climate resilient scavenger hunt to build interest with our younger community members. We're hoping to engage future Delta stakeholders and leaders. We posted a list of real world and digital activities that explore how climate change may affect the youth and their communities. The idea is to complete as many of these activities and then submit results online. Also, the Delta DAPS initiative was written up in the press last week, a newspaper publication for the East Contra Costa County area with a distribution of about 40,000 people. And then next slide for adaptation scoping. We also, as previously mentioned, we have our first public meeting tonight at 4:30 to hear the public's thoughts on the scope of adaptation. And then if you can't make today's meeting, there's also one scheduled for March 1st. They'll cover similar presentations and just offering a second workshop for the public to attend. And you can register online through our website to attend those meetings. And we'll report back on what we hear at a future council meeting. Next slide, I just wanted you all to be aware that we did make a video and released it in January to the public. Our community partners recommended we prepare a video as background on the Delta Stewardship Council and the Delta Adapts Initiative. It's a great primer for our outreach activities and public workshops and gives an overview of the vulnerability assessment key findings. In the interest of time, we aren't going to show it today, but if you haven't already, please take a look. And it's on the Delta Adapts page on the council's website. And that wraps it up for me. So just want to open it up to public comment.
Do we have any public comments?
A few. I'll start off with the first one. Let me check real quick if they're on. They said they might have to leave if it's after 11. Yeah, they're not on. So they've asked me to read their comment. This is from Chandra Chilmakuri, and apologies if I mispronounced that. Good morning, Chair Tatayan, council members. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment today regarding Agenda Item 8, the public review draft of Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment. My name is Chandra, Assistant General Manager for Water Policy of the State Water Contractors. The State Water Contractors represent 27 of the 29 agencies that contract for water supplies from the State Water Project. Collectively, the members provide a portion of the water supply delivered to approximately 27 million Californians, roughly 2/3 of the state's population, and to over 750,000 acres of irrigated agriculture. State Water Project supplies delivered to the Bay Area, San Joaquin Valley, Central Coast, and Southern California are diverted from the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. We believe this comprehensive vulnerability assessment can help guide future investments in the Delta and inform planning for decades to come. We appreciate the extended public comment period to allow time for a thorough and thoughtful review of the draft. We are in the process of reviewing the draft and will submit written comments. We also would like to thank you for including the contractors in your stakeholder working group and acknowledge council staff for taking time to meet with us to discuss issues and questions specific to the contractors. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to providing input and continuing participation in the stakeholder work group as the vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy develops. All right, next up is Deirdre Desjardins, and let me go ahead and allow her to speak. Deirdre, can you hear us?
Yes, Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I think this is an incredibly important study. California Water Research spent years making comments on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan that it did not adequately consider new estimates of sea level rise. And as we know, the estimates of sea level rise have extreme sea level rise have almost doubled over the last decade. So this new study is just incredibly important, and the science is absolutely sound. I've looked at it. I think some of the innovative ways in which you've captured uncertainty and risk of flooding is really helpful. I particularly like the map of what flooding is dominated by sea level rise and what's dominated by river flows. Stockton is the 7th largest city in California, and in many ways it's like the New Orleans of the West Coast. And I've looked at their proposed levee upgrades, and they haven't taken into account sea level rise. And very concerned that they're making the same mistake as the lower Ninth Ward, where by the time they complete the upgrades around 2040, they won't have raised the levees that are needed to protect these urban populations. I'm very concerned about impacts on Delta communities and and the legacy communities, and their ability to engage on this. It's critical to their survival. So I really appreciate what you've done, and I hope and I appreciate Harriet Ross's blog and the other efforts you've made to engage the community. You're absolutely on the front lines here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Deirdre, for taking the time to comment.
So that is the end of my list. However, Chair Tatayan, I have allowed the raised hand function really quick if anybody in the audience does want to quickly provide any further comments. All right, I'm not seeing any. I think that's it.
Okay. Well, I think that wraps up agenda item 9, unless council members have questions for Harriet. Great. Well, hearing none, thank you very much, Harriet.
Thank you.
Thank you. So on to agenda item 10, the lead scientist report with Dr. Laurel Larson.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan, and welcome to Councilmember Smith. I look forward to getting to meet you. Brandon, could I please have the visual abstract slide? Thank you. So, this has been a really invigorating meeting so far, and after all of the excellent content of the earlier agenda items, I find I've worked up an appetite. Well, grab some ginger and wasabi because we're going to be talking about sushi in this report. Or more specifically, a project that has fondly been termed the Nigiri project. That I'm spotlighting today at the beginning of this report, led by Ted Sommer of Department of Water Resources and co-authored by Louise Conrad, who you heard from earlier today, and Lynn Takata of the Delta Science Program, discusses lessons learned from 6 years of managed floodplain experiments in the Yolo bypass. The project has been termed the Nigiri project because it is all about co-management of floodplains for fish and rice cultivation. It is the product of a collaboration among the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, Department of Water Resources, California Trout, and the landowners themselves who really wanted their land to achieve the most benefit for a broad suite of purposes, farming, birds, and fish. But I am getting a little ahead of myself. I will back up and explain this project from the beginning, but before I do want to highlight that this work examines what could be referred to as a multi-benefit or nature-based solution for ecosystem management of the type that Letitia was just discussing in her report earlier. Such multi-benefit solutions are called for in Governor Newsom's water resilience portfolio. And this article that I'm spotlighting today, by the way, appears in the San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science Journal, which is a journal funded by, but independent from, the Delta Stewardship Council. So first, some background on the Yolo bypass is appropriate here. This is one of the focal areas of the study. It was originally conceptualized as a place to contain flood waters and route floods away from Sacramento, but the Yolo bypass is also one of the last remaining active floodplain areas, albeit in a highly managed sense, within the Central Valley. In fact, more than 95% of natural floodplain wetlands in the region have been eliminated. So considering that these wetlands represent rearing habitat for juvenile salmon, this widespread elimination of floodplain access constitutes a huge stressor on salmon populations. The Nagiri project examined whether by extending the natural flood pulse through retention of water on fields, first in the Yolo bypass and then ultimately in other locations throughout the Central Valley, including Sutter bypass and Dos Rios, which is a San Joaquin River floodplain area, that positive benefits could be realized for juvenile Chinook salmon. To be clear, the intervention that was examined here was manipulating drainage from the fields such that they retained naturally occurring floodwaters longer. So this is a fairly small intervention with potentially large impacts. And the answer to the question of whether this intervention produced benefits for the Chinook salmon was yes, yes, yes. Not only was the prey of the salmon, zooplankton, more abundant in the floodplain habitat than in the adjacent river, as you can see in this schematic diagram that Byron Riggins prepared, but salmon growth rates were also higher. Surprisingly and conveniently, there was not much difference in these positive results across fields with different substrate types, such as fallowed fields, disked fields, or those that were farmed for rice. But to achieve the results depicted on this slide, certain conditions did need to apply. First, the floodplain habitat needed to maintain connection, a hydrologic connection to the river, and maintain flows. The salmon were found behaviorally to be attracted to inflow locations, possibly because of the food they contained, but they also needed outflow connections in order to escape predation on the floodplain. Second, these positive results did not hold for very dry years, when the salmon essentially got cooked by the warmer floodwaters on the floodplain, baked salmon instead of nigiri, if you will, and suffered much higher rates of predation due to the much more limited and concentrated habitat for wading birds. Third, the conditions required for extended flood pulses were rather rare. During 2 wet years, the whole system was flooded, making it impossible to contain floodwaters within the study fields. But during the dry years, the Yolo bypass didn't flood at all. Only during moderate flood pulses was this type of intervention possible. The authors of the study acknowledged that the plans underway to notch the Fremont Weir will likely facilitate achievement of these moderate flood pulses on a more frequent basis. But on the other hand, the more frequent weather whiplash events that are expected for California's future, in which we alternate between wet and dry extremes, will make those ideal Goldilocks conditions more rare. So as a quick reminder, Dr. Louise Conrad spoke about the weather whiplash phenomenon in the December lead scientist report. And next month in March, I will highlight another recent article that complements those findings. Going back to this study, this study was important, not just because it illustrates a successful set of examples of multi-benefit solutions of the type that might go into a water resilience portfolio, but it also directly addresses one of the priority actions identified in the current science action agenda, which is to investigate the most cost-effective methods to improve species habitat on working lands. But as you heard today, that success is conditional. It's a little like winning free sushi in a raffle and then seeing the statement terms and conditions apply. This study underscores both the opportunity to identify additional lands in the Delta that could be managed in this win-win way, but also the need to prioritize these management decisions based on projections of changing flows and water temperatures. Both this need and opportunity argue for a landscape scale perspective, as Letitia discussed in her report, in planning for resilience. It also argues for a nimble system for water management that is responsive to thresholds or triggers in flow and temperature. I'll just conclude this part of the report by urging you to stay tuned on the topic of how the best available science here can support management. NOAA fisheries, NGOs like CalTrout and CDFW are partnering to plan a symposium on managed floodplains in the fall, and both Louise Conrad and Lynn Takata, the 2 DSC staff members who are co-authors on this paper, are involved in the planning committee. A focus will be on identifying what else we need to know in order to create a management paradigm that allows us to leverage these habitats to the best of our ability. And as a prelude to the meeting, the DSP will be producing fact sheets summarizing the latest science. So that concludes the part of my report that spotlights this particular article. And before I go on to the remainder of the report, I want to pause here and see if there might be questions from the council members on what I've just reported on. Okay, if there are no questions, I will go on to the next part of my report, which I'll keep brief. I will next report out on a few of our recent program activities. And I'm going to keep these brief because you have heard about them in previous portions of the council meeting today. One is a brief report out on the Adaptive Management Forum, which was hosted virtually on February 3rd through 5th. And again, this forum was an opportunity for the Delta community to share knowledge and promote collaboration around adaptive management of the Bay Delta system. And it's a meeting that brought together both scientists and managers. Our forum featured morning sessions with plenary talks and presentations by invited speakers, followed by question and answer panels and breakout discussions. And then there were 3 sets of workshops that were held during the afternoon sessions. In addition to the workshop that you just heard about from Letitia on the Delta Landscape Scenario Planning Tool, there was also a workshop on permitting adaptive management and Adaptive Management Planning 101, which provided additional opportunities for the participants to interact, network, and learn about specific tools and practices. I'm happy to report that over 250 people attended the forum, and each workshop itself had 35 to 70 participants. If you would like to learn more about what took place during the workshop, there are now videos of the presentations posted on the council's website under the events dropdown, and a proceedings report will be forthcoming shortly. And then I'd also like to say that the ideas shared at this forum are already starting to influence the dialogue about adaptive management in the Bay Delta. As you heard from Letitia, her tool had great reception and generated a lot of excitement at the workshop. And reports on other adaptive management projects within the Bay Delta also did the same. So critically, these ideas are going to help shape the way that the Delta Science Program will continue to work to fulfill the part of its mission related to promoting science-based adaptive management with Delta agencies. The second recent event that I would like to report out on briefly is the steelhead workshop, monitoring steelhead populations in the San Joaquin Basin. And this workshop just recently took place at the end of through last week between February 17th and 19th. At the workshop, participants reviewed the management challenges and monitoring framework for steelhead and explored analytical approaches to measuring the impact of management actions on San Joaquin Basin steelhead. This workshop, as a reminder, supported the biological opinion on long-term operation of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project, which aims to develop a plan to monitor steelhead populations within the San Joaquin Basin and/or San Joaquin River downstream of the confluence with the Stanislaus River. And this includes steelhead and rainbow trout on non-project San Joaquin tributaries as well. And a more detailed report out on the workshop is forthcoming. In terms of things to keep on your radar, the biennial Bay Delta Science Conference is coming up, as you heard from Louise. I'm not going to say much more about that other than a reminder of the dates, April 6th through 9th. So please do get that on your calendar and look to the Delta Stewardship Council website, again, under the events tab in the next few weeks, because a registration link will be posted. Registration, again, for this meeting is free. So plan on attending parts of the meeting that are relevant to your interests, and stay tuned. Again, the website will soon feature an agenda for that meeting. And the other thing I'd like to report on is just ongoing progress with our recent proposal solicitation, which you heard about earlier this morning. Just as a reminder, this is a proposal solicitation between the Delta Science Program and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and we're collaborating with California Sea Grant. to issue this proposal solicitation. The solicitation will fund 12 to 31 month duration projects that advance the 2017 to 2021 Science Action Agenda. And we expect that the total amount of funding to be awarded is $9 million. I'm happy to report that we received 99 proposals as of the February 12th deadline, which is double the number that we received in previous years. And those proposals are in the process of being allocated to review by external experts in a review panel. Awarded contracts are going to have a start date as early as July 1st of 2021. So as Louise mentioned, you'll hear a more detailed report on the projects that we are awarding funding to later this year. And then finally, you'll see in your packet the by the numbers report, which for new council members reports on the current hydrologic status of reservoirs and snowpack and exports within the Delta. And so just briefly, I'll say that despite rain here and snow in the Sierras, we're still hovering at just over half of where we typically are for water storage in February. So as you heard from the Delta Water Master, Michael George, we are facing drought conditions in the near future. The Northern and Central Sierra have received just 53% and 56% of typical precipitation to date, respectively. And storage in the Shasta, San Luis, and Oroville reservoirs is between 55 and 69% of what's typical for this time of year. Sacramento and San Joaquin river flows are between 32 and 35% of average, and combined Central Valley Project and State Water Project diversions are at just 63%. So this has been a long report. Now go eat some sushi.
Thank you, Laurel. Boy, now I'm really hungry for sushi. Are there any questions for Dr. Larson, council members? I just want to say I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to tour the Nagiri project, and it is an amazing project. It's quite interesting to see the scientists pulling salmon from among rice fields. It's very innovative, creative. Well, thank you, Laurel.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan. Thank you, council members, for your time.
So on to agenda item 11, environmental justice issue paper. Our executive officer, Jessica Pearson, will lead us off here.
Thank you, Chair Tatayan. Members, most of you will recall that in the 2019 statutorily required 5-year review of the Delta Plan, that you identified environmental justice as a key issue for council focus and recommended that staff prepare an issue paper to inform future actions to address environmental justice and better serve disadvantaged communities in our work. But today's presentation serves as a kickoff for this effort. And today we are looking for feedback from you on the process and scope and to assess whether we're headed in the right direction. So I would like to now introduce or reintroduce Harriet Ross and also Avery Livengood, who will lead us through the presentation and the discussion.
Yeah, good morning again. I'm pleased to be opening up this agenda item given the continued importance of addressing environmental justice in the Delta. If we can move on to the next slide. Before we dive into our presentation, I just wanted to show the questions we're hoping to get your feedback on today. Thought you may want to provide input during the presentation, or we can circle back at the end. The questions are related to the objectives of the environmental justice issue paper and the range of issues to be addressed. And lastly, if there are any thoughts you may have on organizations and agencies we should partner with on public engagement. Next slide, please. California was one of the first states to codify environmental justice in statute in 1999. Under state law, environmental justice means, as you can see there on the slide, the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The environmental justice movement really started in response to the disproportionate share of environmental impacts borne by certain communities, particularly low-income communities of color. And some of these environmental impacts include pollution, land or water contamination, or other hazards. However, over the years, the concept of environmental justice has broadened over time to focus not only on the distribution of those undesirable impacts, but also on representation and inclusion of everyone in planning processes. These components are often referred to as as recognition or representation of the community, procedural justice or the process of engaging the community, and distribution of benefits and impacts, or distributive justice, Next slide, please. So why are we preparing an issue paper on environmental justice? In recent years, the state of California has made environmental justice a priority with the passage of numerous legislation. Many of the council's peer state agencies have recently adopted or are in the process of developing environmental justice policies, principles, or guidelines. As previously mentioned, the council's 5-year review also identified environmental justice as a key emerging issue, noting a specific need for more information and analysis to inform potential future actions. The survey responses and stakeholder interviews for the 5-year review highlighted environmental justice concerns relating to all 3 categories of justice: representation, process, and distribution. The council also recommended that an issue paper be prepared to study the potential need for strategies or responses to address disadvantaged communities and environmental justice in the Delta Plan. And just to note, so we have a common definition, we are defining an issue paper as one that summarizes the best available science and stakeholder input, really to educate and inform the council on the topic and identify potential actions or solutions that can be taken to address those issues. Next slide. Drawing upon the 5-year review, public participation plan, and the Delta Adapts outreach process, we've developed the following preliminary objectives for this paper. And this is really a starting point for discussion with all of you and our community stakeholders. And those preliminary objectives include the 3 on the screen there. The first is to build a network of community leaders and organizations to inform and support the council's environmental justice work, identify environmental justice issues within the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the Delta watershed, and areas that use Delta water, and lastly, to identify options to address those issues. Once the paper is complete, implementation options will be presented for council consideration. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Avery to give you more details on the issue paper.
Thank you, Harriet, and thank you, council members, for your time. I'll be presenting on our proposed scope and approach. So as Harriet mentioned, the issue paper was recommended at the end of the 5-year review. And the 5-year review recommended that the issue paper include guidance and findings from 3 initiatives that were ongoing in 2019 at the time that the 5-year review was prepared. And those are the Social Science Task Force, the Public Participation Plan, and Delta Adapts. So now that 2 of those initiatives are complete and phase 1 of Delta Adapts is nearing completion, we're prepared to begin work on the EJ issue paper. And I'm going to quickly walk through each of these initiatives and explain how they're influencing our approach to the issue paper. Next slide, please. So first, the Social Science Task Force issued its final strategy in April 2020. And the report noted a need for increased social science capacity and more social science research to better understand and inform priority issues in the Delta. Among those was environmental justice. And the task force recommended hiring staff to help champion social science in the Delta. And last year, California Sea Grant and the council hired Dr. Jessica Rudnick as an initial step. And you heard from Dr. Rudnick at the council meeting last month. Dr. Rudnick is advising on integrating social science methods into the issue paper, including the potential for participatory data collection as part of our engagement process. Next slide. The Public Participation Plan was endorsed by the Council in June of 2020, and the plan lays out specific expectations for the environmental justice issue paper. First among these is to include a public engagement process that draws upon the tools outlined in the plan. And so we are currently considering tools such as an advisory panel, direct outreach, stakeholder interviews, and public workshops. Second, the plan recommended exploring opportunities to collaborate with community-based organizations during the development of the issue paper. And we've already begun contacting community-based organizations in and around the Delta to notify them of this effort. And we'll be working to design a collaborative engagement process based on these initial discussions. Third, the public participation plan recommended that the council provide staff with training in the fundamentals of environmental justice and outreach techniques to disadvantaged communities. And we've actually already been sort of working towards this over the past year. In our Delta Adapts process, staff have participated in a range of online workshops and trainings to inform our engagement approach. We've attended trainings on equitable online engagement, trauma-informed engagement, and climate justice and resilience planning, to name a few. So we will continue to participate in trainings that we identify as related to environmental justice and the issue paper. Next slide. And finally, Delta Adapts. Delta Adapts is where we've taken some initial steps to put recommendations from the public participation plan into practice. We conducted early outreach. We began contacting and consulting with community-based organizations starting in 2019 and have built up a database of nearly 100 contacts. We partnered with a coalition of organizations in Stockton, as Harriet already mentioned, over the past year to organize and host a workshop on Delta Adapts, and that workshop occurred earlier this month. And we've also been exploring contracting options to be able to compensate community-based organizations for their participation and support with outreach. We've learned a lot from this process, and our lessons learned will inform how we approach engagement on the issue paper. In addition, as part of the technical analysis for the Delta Adapts vulnerability assessment, staff developed a social vulnerability index for the Delta based on indicators from the scientific literature and feedback from community organizations. And the vulnerability assessment includes a set of findings related to the disproportionate impacts of climate change, which will carry over directly into the issue paper. Next slide. So we would like to acknowledge that environmental justice is not a new topic in the Delta, and many Delta stakeholders have been engaged on environmental justice for many years, including before the council was established. So we're not starting from scratch, and we do intend to draw from that history and from past comments on Delta Plan amendments, the 5-year review, and Delta Adapts. The list on this slide and the list in the staff report is intended to illustrate some of the issues that have been raised in past comments and in Delta planning processes. It's meant to be illustrative, it's not a comprehensive list. But as you can see, there's a very broad range of issues that the paper could evaluate. And some of the items on this list are very broad categories in and of themselves. For example, the distribution of environmental impacts encompasses a litany of more specific concerns about disproportionate impacts, and we could explore any number of those. I appreciate that Michael George highlighted some of these in his remarks earlier in the meeting. Based on this preliminary list, we anticipate that corresponding responses could include a broad range of interventions as well. Anything from Delta Plan amendments to performance measures to science program funding and research agendas to the council's procurement, participation, and communication practices. So in order to develop the issue paper scope, staff will seek broad participation and input on priorities that could help focus or expand on this list of issues and the corresponding options. And we're also seeking your initial input here today. So as Harriet highlighted at the beginning, that's one of our discussion questions for today.
Can I ask a question over on the slide? For Avery or Harriet. So I'm curious, with the bullet point land ownership, by just some explanation around what it was defined as or put forth as the issue or what that entails. It was kind of vague.
Yeah, this is meant to apply to state land ownership. A lot of concerns have been raised about state land ownership in the Delta and the effects of that on local communities.
You answered the question. When you put the state in front of that, I understand. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Harriet
Question
and Avery, Daniel has a question for you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Harriet and Avery, for doing this important work. I have one suggestion you didn't mention among the trainings, but maybe you said it wasn't comprehensive, so maybe it's already on there. But if not, please consider systemic racism as a focus of training, and maybe a larger focus of the broader work you're talking about here. There's some very important recent literature in that area, and it's we all know it exists, but it's so much ingrained in all of our systems and decision making and processes that we often miss it. So I've found that to be enlightening. I think it could really help inform this process. And the other thing I wanted to just commend is that you mentioned compensation. One form of systemic racism, I believe, is all of us on this call right now are likely compensated in some way for our participation, but often when we go out with good intention to engage residents or youth or others, it's just assumed their time will be on a voluntary basis. So I hope we'll look at that through an equity lens, that their time is at least as valuable as ours. If you're out there struggling and you're young or you're disadvantaged, that compensation is an appropriate component of their engagement. Thanks again.
Thank you for that feedback. Staff are coordinating with our internal diversity committee to explore trainings that cut across the issues of environmental justice and systemic racism and racial equity. So we're definitely looking into that, and I appreciate that you highlighted that. And then with regard to compensation, we are continuing to explore, based on our experience with Delta Adapts, we're continuing to explore procurement mechanisms and options to be able to compensate for folks' time and effort participating in our processes. So we're definitely looking into that.
Terrific, thank you.
With respect to training, the folks that the water master described living near the Delta and homeless situations, to what extent are you going to, is there going to be kind of an outreach to those folks? To what extent are you going to really, you have to take the first step, I think, and for many of those folks. And I think that the ability to reach out is going to be very important. Is there some thought given to that type of training and such?
Definitely. We actually highlighted that as an issue in the draft vulnerability assessment for Delta Adapts, because it came up in our literature review that people experiencing homelessness are at greatest risk of impacts from climate change and are often disproportionately affected by natural disasters. As far as I know, so far staff have made contact with the Sacramento Housing Alliance, and I believe one other organization that works with homeless populations in the Sacramento area. The name is not coming to me right now. But we're primarily looking at working with organizations that work with those populations to get their input and feedback on the issue paper. If they end up advising us to engage directly with people experiencing homelessness as part of our outreach and engagement process, then we'll definitely be taking account of their advice. But at this point, we're targeting our outreach more to the organizations that serve those populations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these great questions and the input. Any other questions or comments before I move on to the next slide? Great, thank you, Brent. Sorry, muted myself. So our scope could also be influenced through coordination with other state agencies that are working on related initiatives in the Delta and in Sassoon Marsh. For example, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission adopted environmental justice amendments to the Bay Plan in 2019, and they are now actively implementing their environmental justice policy in the Bay Area, including in the Sassoon Marsh, where they share jurisdiction with the council. So that's one area where we're trying to kind of align our efforts, and we're actively coordinating with our sister agencies as well. In addition, many local agencies in California are in the process of amending their general plans to address environmental justice as required by SB 1000. So local agencies are undertaking their own public engagement processes to inform their amendments, and we intend to leverage the findings from those local engagement and planning processes to inform the issue paper. Next slide, please. This is a high-level snapshot of our timeline. Perhaps somewhat unusually, we're taking several months at the beginning for startup, and this is to account for the current social distancing guidelines associated with the pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty around when we might be able to engage with stakeholders in person, if at all. We're also trying to consider the need to align outreach with other state agencies' outreach and other council projects, as well as the desire to get input on the engagement process from environmental justice and community organizations. So as I mentioned earlier, we're doing some initial informal outreach to community organizations right now, working towards a more formal engagement strategy. We're hoping to have that ready by July, and then we'll initiate more formal systematic engagement in the fall. And we are targeting having a draft of the issue paper complete for public review in the spring of 2022, and we'll hopefully be able to bring a draft for council consideration in the summer of 2022. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. We've outlined a few questions to guide discussion. As Harriet already mentioned, we would welcome your feedback on the objectives, the scope, interagency coordination, stakeholder engagement, and any other comments or questions that you might have.
I can go first. Somehow I'm more interested in what comes out of the surveys and the discussions that you're having with multiple agencies and with the stakeholders in the area in terms of residents and other groups that are working in the area. It seems to me that the issues are not going to be very different from each other, from area to area. I might be wrong. I think some details might be, but the most important issues are going to show trends. So for me, it's what we hear and collect from our research is really important. And then maybe after looking at what comes out of those prioritization that the stakeholders give, we could probably layer ourselves on top of that from the way I see it.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback. We're definitely hoping to have a very robust public input process and be able to focus in based on the issues that stakeholders want to prioritize and have highlighted.
Judge?
Yeah, the comment I have is that getting back to this homeless issue, I suspect there's a lot more homeless people living near the water of the Delta than we have any idea of. And I would like to see some method of trying to, I know you're going to work with organizations, but I would suspect there's a lot of folks that are in that situation that live near the Delta and in the Delta. And I think that some kind of an idea of what numbers are we talking about, who these people are would be very helpful. Determining if we're going to reach out to them, I think that's part of the process also, reaching out and doing some kind of a census of the folks that in fact are homeless and live near the Delta.
Yeah, we can certainly you know, the counties usually do homeless counts. I can't remember. I think it's on an annual basis, and we can certainly inquire if they break that number down by, I'm assuming by areas within counties, and we can also inquire about quantification of homeless folks with the service providers as well. That would be good to get a general sense of the number of folks.
And another agency group that might be able to help inform this effort are the levee maintenance agencies. I know that they frequently interact with homeless encampments, and so they might have some data on like the locations where folks are concentrated, and we could reach out to them to see if they have data that they can share with us.
Well, if there are no other questions or comments from other council members, I do have a question for Harriet and Avery, and that is the stakeholders that you'll be reaching out to. Do we have a list that you could share with the council members? That would be informative.
Yeah, we have a list, and we can certainly share that, and would welcome any additions or thoughts you had on that list.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, just going back to Member Dameral's comments and suggestions to maybe be of some assistance to Harriet and Avery and following up on that. As Harriet said, most communities, counties do, and although we postponed ours because of COVID last year, do a point in time count. It does have some geographic metrics around it, and we know that it's obvious if one did their own tour today or visit, you could see along our waterways, certainly in the American River Parkway, along many tributaries that feed into the Delta, which all of them, one way or the other in this county, end up either getting into the Sacramento or into the Cosumnes systems. There's, there is some data, and that might be helpful. And again, we know certainly with respect to not only the plight of those folks who are homeless or in encampments or living along the waterways and elsewhere, but also some of the impacts to the water quality, to the Delta, and to other aspects of the environment as they struggle to get by. So I think there may be some, just as in my role as a county supervisor, I know that we're very engaged in those conversations. I think you would find other communities, counties in large part, but maybe cities as well, having some data that could assist in providing some of that documentation. So if I can help, I wanted to offer that. If certainly put you in touch with folks here in Sacramento, but I think there's a network of folks that could maybe help address some of the points that Judge Damerald made. So I wanted to offer that. And just secondly, I just want to say, I think that, your range of preliminary issues, there are other things that I'm sure folks may come upon in their comments that would add to the list. But I did see that a number of those points on the list were key and important. And I would just say, I think you're on the right track in your work here. So I wanted to offer that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, hearing no other comments, thank you, Harriet and Avery, for all your hard work.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Chair Tatian, we do have one public comment.
Okay.
So we have Paul Seeger. Let me go ahead and unmute him. Paul, can you hear us? Paul, you should be able to unmute yourself now if you're able to.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, so I like all the words that I'm hearing. I love seeing that you want to be engaged with Envision 2040. I live in Oakley, and And Envision 2040 for the Contra Costa General Plan update includes Bethel Island and Knightson. Knightson is being targeted for some sort of marsh restoration project. Bethel Island is obviously a Delta Island. Oakley is, and then you also have Oakley in there, and they're working on their general plan update as well. And as far as environmental justice, the city of Oakley is currently, they just approved some development in the East Cypress corridor, the Hotchkiss tract very near Bethel Island, where they're going to be putting in more than 1,000 homes within a floodplain. And it's been identified by both your organization and the BCDC as being an area of concern for sea level rise, and even just a 100-year storm event, not to mention extreme weather events that would be coming in the future. The projects in Oakley are mixed use, which means that most likely there will be renters, a lot of renters there, low income, middle income, affordable housing. And the city of Oakley has yet to have any discussions about sea level rise or climate change. And in East Contra Costa County, there seems to be no conversations or even any concern whatsoever. And I am very concerned that the conversation can't even be had. So I appreciate where you're going. Development is moving quickly because they see the writing on the wall. And I might suggest that some of our council members who, some of your council members who live and represent in our area, have a conversation, start the conversation, and take responsibility, because at some point somebody is going to be liable, whether it be in 10 years or 50 years, for just looking the other way when this is going on. I attended the Envision 2040 for the environmental justice portion, which was they had one a couple weeks ago, and every time I brought up these issues, I was cut off, and we just don't have time for this, and it was not. I don't think that was a very honest and productive way to handle that. And so that's my comment at this time. And I'd really like to see you guys make some effort to take a look at some of these developments that have been approved and are just on the cutting board, and they're ready to go. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for taking the time to comment. Thanks.
Hey, Susan, this is Daniel. Would it be appropriate for staff to give us a sense of what role, if any, the council would have in responding to comments like we just heard, which raised some serious questions and concerns? Is there some way we can respond by providing some scientific information to local jurisdictions when an issue like this is raised, or how do we process input like we just heard?
Harriet or Avery?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then just to let the council know, Contra Costa County is part of our stakeholder work group. And so we have had, well, before COVID, we had regular meetings with Contra Costa County on their general plan update. And in COVID, we have had a couple of conference calls on their work as well as ours, and how our flooding work is different from BCDC's, what's the Adapting to Rising Tides program, I'm sorry. And so we have some differences in our flooding maps. We talk through those differences with the county. They understand everything going on. So we have been in regular communication with staff, and they know and understand our vulnerability assessment, and they have participated in our meetings in review of the findings. So I can cover that part. Avery, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, I thought, the regulatory review and the covered actions process as things move forward.
Sure. So I'm not familiar with the specifics of the project that was described, but in general, staff review all application referrals that are sent to us by the local agencies to screen for potential covered actions, which are the types of projects that we have regulatory authority over. And when it comes to land use projects in general, we do not have regulatory authority over projects that are proposed within the urban limit line in Contra Costa County. So that may be the case for this particular project. I'm not sure, since I don't know the specifics. I will say that this EJ issue paper could definitely explore issues like this. However, it's unlikely to affect projects that are already in the works simply because of the timing. It's very unlikely that the issue paper would be complete and we would have any, concrete changes to our process before a project that's already underway is implemented. So just something to keep in mind. We'll definitely, explore issues that are raised, like the issues that were just raised by Paul, but it may not have implications for projects that are already underway.
And Chair to time, Paul's raised his hand again to respond.
Okay.
The council for me to, okay. Okay, Paul, you can unmute yourself again.
Thank you. Okay, I appreciate your comments and your concern. That is of the utmost importance to me. And I just wanted to let you know that the city of Oakley, which is its own local, land use jurisdiction, these are two projects among, I think there's 6 that are going to be coming forward, and I'm guessing, and just from living around here, that these projects will start coming forward very quickly, possibly before the general plan is completed for Oakley. So as far as the environmental justice portion of the last presentation, where you put up all of the areas that are updating their general plans, Oakley is one of them. And I know that, I believe that Councilman Fuller is on the commission, and maybe he's on this commission. I don't know. It's hard to follow all these Delta commissions. But it's a conversation I would really hope could ensue as far as touching base and looking into the other projects as they're still sort of renegotiating terms because of the latest science and reports that have come out. So yeah, that would be great. So there are, maybe these two get through, but I would say please have a conversation, take a very close look at the other, I think 4 or 5 projects that are due to come up. And again, thank you.
And if I could add, Chair, we can definitely reach out to the city of Oakley and meet with them on their upcoming projects. And I should point out also that the city of Oakley staff have been invited to our stakeholder work group. They are also part of that group as well, and they have participated, though I'm not sure in the last meeting. But we can definitely reach out and have the conversation.
Great, thank you, Harriet. If there are no other questions from the council and no other public comment, we can move on to agenda item 12, public comment on in general.
There is no general public comment.
Okay. Well, then that takes us to agenda item 13, preparation for the next council meeting. We're anticipating the next meeting will be over 2 days, not entire days, but will take place over 2 days, March 25 and 26. And again, will be virtual.
Mhm.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll see you next time.
Will do.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.